I spent 40 years auditing the most corrupt banks in America, but the greatest financial fraud I ever witnessed happened right in my own living room. My son handed me what he called routine Medicare paperwork while I was looking for my reading glasses. I signed them to get him off my back. A month later, armed sheriffs showed up at my door to throw me out into the pouring rain. My son had used my home as collateral to save his wife and her failing business, and they let the bank foreclose on me. As I stood on the wet pavement with nothing but a duffel bag, my daughter-in-law smirked and told me to find a homeless shelter. But they forgot one crucial detail. You do not steal from a former federal bank examiner and expect to keep the money. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been betrayed by the people you trusted the most. The heavy pounding on my front door started exactly at 8 o'clock at night. The rain was coming down in sheets, beating violently against the roof of the house I had owned free and clear for over 2 decades. I am Harrison Cole. Most folks call me Harry. I am 73 years old and my knees do not move as fast as they used to. I set down my cup of decaf tea, pushed myself up from my worn leather recliner, and walked slowly toward the foyer. I expected it to be a delivery driver lost in the storm. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. It was not a delivery driver. Standing on my porch, water dripping from the brims of their hats, were 2 uniformed deputies from the county sheriff department. But that was not what made my heart skip a beat. Standing just behind the deputies, sheltered by the large black umbrellas they were holding, was my 40-year-old son Julian and his white wife Victoria. Julian was staring at his expensive leather shoes, refusing to make eye contact with me. Victoria was standing tall, her arms crossed over her designer trench coat, looking at me with an expression of complete and utter boredom. The older deputy stepped forward and held out a thick stack of legal documents enclosed in a clear plastic sleeve. He asked if I was Harrison Cole. I told him I was. He handed me the papers and said he was executing an immediate order of eviction and property seizure on behalf of the regional commercial bank. He told me the property had been completely foreclosed due to a defaulted commercial mortgage, and I had exactly 15 minutes to gather my essential belongings and vacate the premises. I looked at the deputy like he was speaking a foreign language. I told him there must be a massive administrative error. I explained that my late wife Beatrice and I paid off the mortgage on this property 22 years ago. I told him I had the original deed sitting in a fireproof safe in my study. There was no loan, there was no debt. The deputy looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. He said the property was used as collateral for a $4 million commercial business loan exactly 8 months ago. The loan had gone into severe default and the bank had exercised its legal right to seize the collateral. He pointed to the documents in my hand. I looked down at the paperwork. Attached to the front page was a copy of the collateral agreement. I stared at the bottom of the page. There, in stark black ink, was my signature, my real, authentic signature. My mind raced backward, tearing through my memories until I hit a brick wall. 1 month ago. Julian had rushed into the house on a Tuesday morning. He was sweating, speaking fast, telling me my Medicare supplemental insurance was about to lapse if I did not sign a renewal form that very minute. I had misplaced my reading glasses. I told him I could not read the fine print. Julian smiled, put his hand on my shoulder, and told me he had read it all. He flipped to the last page, pointed his expensive gold pen at the dotted line, and told me to just sign so he could fax it to the insurance broker. I trusted my son. I signed the paper. I looked up from the eviction notice and stared directly at Julian. "You used my home," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet rumble. "You used the home your mother and I built to secure a commercial loan for Victoria failing logistics company." Julian finally looked up. He did not look ashamed. He looked annoyed. He said I did not understand business. He said Victoria Company just needed a temporary cash injection to stay afloat, but the market shifted and the bank called the loan early. He said it was out of his hands. He actually had the nerve to sound like he was the victim of a bad economy. The deputy interrupted our family nightmare. He told me the clock was ticking. 15 minutes. I did not scream. I did not fall to my knees and beg my son for mercy. I am a man who spent 3 decades at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation dismantling the lies of corrupt bankers. I know when a trap has been fully sprung. I turned my back on my son and walked into the house. I walked into the bedroom I used to share with Beatrice. The scent of her lavender perfume still lingered in the closet. I grabbed a small canvas duffel bag. I did not pack my expensive suits. I did not pack the fine china. I packed 3 changes of clothes, my blood pressure medication, and a framed photograph of Beatrice smiling at our wedding. Then I opened my desk drawer and grabbed my old leather-bound FDIC field journal. That was all I needed. I left everything else behind. The television, the comfortable bed, the antique dining table. None of it mattered anymore. I walked back to the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold rain blew sideways, soaking through my thin jacket instantly. The deputy stepped inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The loud click of the deadbolt locking felt like a physical blow to my chest. I was officially trespassing on my own property. I walked slowly down the porch steps. Victoria stepped forward, blocking my path to the driveway. She looked me up and down, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She told me I should look into the homeless shelter down on 5th Street. She said they serve a hot meal at 9 o'clock, and if I hurried, I might get a cot for the night. She said they simply could not afford to put me up in a hotel right now because their assets were tied up in corporate restructuring. She said it with a smile. She was enjoying my destruction. She enjoyed watching the old man who always told Julian to be careful with his money get thrown out into the mud. I did not respond to her taunts. I walked past her, the rain beating down on my face, and climbed into my rusty old Ford pickup truck parked on the street. I put the key in the ignition and started the engine. Through the rain-slicked windshield, I watched Julian and Victoria talking to the deputies under the warm glow of the porch light. They thought they had discarded a useless, senile old man. They thought they had successfully liquidated my life to save their own skin. They had absolutely no idea that they had just declared war on a man who knew exactly how to track every single dirty penny they had ever touched. I parked my rusty Ford pickup under a flickering yellow streetlight in the far corner of a commercial parking lot. The rain drummed a heavy, relentless rhythm against the metal roof. The cabin was freezing, smelling of old leather and damp clothes. I was 73 years old, sitting in the dark with nothing to my name but the canvas duffel bag resting on the passenger seat. Any other man my age might have broken down. Any other father who had just been thrown onto the street by his own flesh and blood would have buried his face in his hands and wept. But I did not shed a single tear. Tears are for people who do not know how to fight back. I reached into my damp jacket pocket and pulled out the folded papers the sheriff deputy had handed me. It was the official eviction and property seizure notice, complete with a copy of the collateral agreement. I turned on the dim overhead dome light of the truck. The pale yellow glow illuminated the damp pages. I stopped being Harrison Cole, the heartbroken father. I became Harry Cole, the senior bank examiner for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I spent 30 years dissecting the financial anatomies of corrupt banks. I knew how to follow the money, and I knew how to find the rot. I stared at the paperwork. The numbers immediately screamed that something was deeply wrong. The loan principal was $4 million. My home, while beautiful and located in a prime neighborhood, was generously appraised at $1.2 million. No legitimate commercial underwriter in the United States would approve a $4 million business loan secured by a single residential property worth a fraction of that cost. The loan-to-value ratio was completely absurd. Then I looked at the timeline. The loan was originated exactly 8 months ago. The foreclosure process was already completed. For a commercial bank to seize a property and execute a sheriff eviction in just 8 months meant that the loan had gone into default almost the very second the funds were dispersed. Julian and Victoria had never made a single payment. They never intended to. It was a classic bust-out scheme. They extracted the cash and threw the collateral to the wolves. But how did they get a heavily regulated regional bank to approve such a glaringly fraudulent loan? A standard loan officer would have red-flagged this in 5 minutes. An underwriter would have rejected the collateral assignment immediately. Someone with serious executive power had to manually override the bank security protocols to push this money through. I flipped to the last page of the collateral agreement. I looked past my own forged authorization signature, focusing on the bottom corner of the document. I was looking for the bank officer who authorized the disbursement and the notary public who stamped the collateral pledge. My eyes locked onto the black ink. The signature was a messy, arrogant scrawl, but the printed name below it was clear as day. Preston Gallagher. The air in the cold truck cabin suddenly felt completely still. Preston Gallagher was Victoria's older brother. He was a white, slick talking executive who currently sat as the vice president of commercial lending at Oakmont Regional Bank. The exact same bank that held the note on this fraudulent mortgage. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, terrifying clarity. This was not just a case of a greedy son tricking his old father out of house and home. This was a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar federal bank fraud orchestrated by a corrupt bank executive to save his sister. I leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes, piecing together the true motive. Why did Victoria need $4 million so quickly that she would risk pulling her brother into a federal felony? I remembered a conversation I overheard between Julian and Victoria about a year ago. They were arguing in my kitchen. Julian had been terrified. He said Victoria Logistics Company was facing a mandatory internal audit by the State Transportation Board. Victoria had been skimming money from her corporate client escrow accounts to fund her lavish lifestyle. She had embezzled millions, and the auditors were coming to count the cash. If the state found the escrow accounts empty, Victoria would go to federal prison for a very long time. She needed a massive cash injection to plug the hole and balance her books before the auditors arrived. But nobody was going to lend $4 million to a failing logistics company. So she went to her brother. Preston could not just steal the money from his bank vault. He needed a paper trail. He needed collateral to justify a massive commercial loan disbursement. They needed a sacrificial lamb. They looked at me, a 73-year-old African-American man living alone in a paid-off property. Julian played the dutiful son. He shoved Medicare paperwork in my face when I did not have my reading glasses, tricking me into signing the collateral pledge. Preston used his executive authority at Oakmont Regional Bank to inflate the appraisal and bypass the underwriting department. He disbursed $4 million directly into Victoria's failing company. Victoria used the stolen money to replace her embezzled funds just in time to pass her state audit, and then they simply let the loan die. They stopped paying. They let Oakmont Regional Bank foreclose on the collateral. They let the sheriff throw me out into the rain. They thought the bank would absorb the loss, Victoria would be saved, and the old man would just fade away in a homeless shelter. It was brilliant, it was ruthless, and it was highly illegal. Under Title 18 of the United States Code, what Preston Gallagher did was a direct violation of federal banking regulations: self-dealing, conflict of interest, wire fraud, and conspiracy to defraud a financial institution. If the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation found out that a bank vice president was issuing fraudulent multi-million-dollar loans to his own sister using stolen collateral, they would not just fire him. They would seize the bank, and the Department of Justice would put Preston, Victoria, and Julian in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. I opened my eyes. I looked at the blurry photocopy in my hand. I had the theory. I had the motive. I had the names. But my 30 years at the agency reminded me of a harsh, unforgiving reality. A blurry photocopy of a foreclosure notice from a sheriff eviction packet was not enough to trigger a full federal raid. A good defense lawyer would argue that the photocopy was doctored. Preston would claim his signature was forged. They would drag the investigation out for years, and by the time the truth came out, the money would be hidden offshore, and I would be dead. I needed the smoking gun. I needed the original internal loan origination file. I needed the wet ink signatures, the internal bank routing numbers, and the digital timestamp of Preston bypassing the underwriting software. I needed the exact documents currently sitting inside the highly secured, heavily guarded central vault of Oakmont Regional Bank. I folded the damp paper and put it back into my jacket pocket. The rain was beginning to slow down, and a faint gray light was creeping over the horizon. The storm was passing, but mine was just beginning. I was a homeless 73-year-old man with no money, no power, and no access. I could not simply walk through the front doors of Oakmont Regional Bank and demand to see their classified loan portfolios. The security guards would throw me out onto the pavement before I even reached the reception desk. I needed an inside man. I needed someone inside that bank who had the clearance to access the executive files, but who hated Preston Gallagher enough to risk their own career to destroy him. I needed to find a weak link in Preston armor. I turned the key in the ignition. The old Ford engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. I put the truck into gear and pulled out of the parking lot. I did not know where I was going to sleep tomorrow night, but I knew exactly where I was going today. I was going to hunt. The morning sun pierced through the rain-streaked windshield of my old Ford pickup, waking me from a fitful, freezing sleep. My bones ached from spending the night curled up on the torn vinyl bench seat. I sat up and rubbed the stiffness from my neck. My phone buzzed in the cup holder. The caller ID flashed my son name, Julian. I took a deep breath, burying the Federal Examiner and pulling up the mask of a broken 73-year-old man. I hit answer. "Dad," Julian said. His voice was smooth, practiced, dripping with that fake corporate sympathy he used to close bad real estate deals. "Listen, I feel terrible about last night. Victoria was just stressed about the company. We both are. But I am still your son, and I cannot just leave you out on the street. Where am I supposed to go, Julian? I said, letting my voice waver perfectly. The sheriff took my keys. I slept in my truck. I know Dad and I am going to fix it, Julian replied quickly. I found a nice little studio apartment for you out in the south suburbs. It is modest, but I will pay the first 6 months of rent out of my own pocket. You will have a roof over your head by tonight. A studio apartment in the south suburbs. He was trying to stash me in a forgotten, rundown corner of the city where no one would hear me complain. That is very kind of you, son, I mumbled, acting overwhelmed with relief. I do not have a dime to my name. There is just one small administrative thing we need to handle first. Julian added, his tone shifting to pure business. The bank needs to close out the foreclosure file cleanly. I am going to buy you a coffee at the diner on 4th Street in an hour. I just need you to sign a standard release of liability form. It just says you vacate the property willingly and will not pursue any frivolous litigation. Standard procedure. A liability waiver. They were terrified. Preston Gallagher knew that if an angry, displaced homeowner started making noise at the state attorney office, someone might look too closely at the loan origination file. They were trying to buy my silence for the price of a cheap, roach-infested studio. Okay, Julian, I whispered. I will be there. I hung up the phone. I reached into my canvas duffel bag and pulled out my old leather-bound field journal. Tucked inside the secret back flap was a high-grade digital voice recorder. I used it to record hostile bank managers during federal audits. I checked the battery. It was fully charged. I slipped it into the breast pocket of my damp jacket and hit record. An hour later, I walked into the bustling diner on 4th Street. The smell of frying bacon and cheap coffee hung in the air. Julian was sitting in a corner booth wearing a tailored gray suit, checking his expensive smartwatch. He looked completely out of place, like a shark slumming it in a goldfish pond. I shuffled over to the booth, leaning heavily on the edge of the table as I sat down. I kept my shoulders slumped. I made sure to look like a man who had entirely given up. Julian slid a steaming mug of black coffee across the table, followed immediately by a thick stack of legal documents and a pen. Drink up, Dad. Then just sign at the bottom of the last page and I will hand you the keys to your new place, Julian said, tapping the paper. I looked down at the document. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement and a blanket waiver of all rights to sue Oakmont Regional Bank Victoria or Julian for any matters related to the property. It was bulletproof. Julian, I said, keeping my eyes fixed on the coffee mug, my voice shaking. I do not understand any of this. How did I lose my house? I paid off that mortgage before your mother died. How did the bank take it? Julian sighed, rolling his eyes with exaggerated patience. Dad, we went over this. You signed the commercial pledge when I brought you those Medicare updates. You authorized it. But $4 million, Julian, I stammered, looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes. That is fraud. That is illegal. What if I go to the police? What if I tell them you tricked me? Julian leaned across the table. The fake sympathy completely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, arrogant sneer. He thought he was talking to an ignorant, powerless old fool. He wanted to crush my last ounce of hope so I would sign the paper without another word. Go to the police, Dad. See what happens, Julian whispered harshly. You think you can beat us in court? Preston is the vice president of commercial lending at Oakmont. He personally authorized the disbursement. His bank legalized everything. They buried the paper trail so deep you would need a federal subpoena just to see the cover page. You have no money, you have no lawyer, and you signed the collateral pledge with your own hand. Suing is useless. Now sign the paper, take the apartment, and be grateful we are not leaving you in a cardboard box. My heart hammered a steady, triumphant rhythm against my ribs. I had it. The explicit admission of premeditated fraud. The confirmation that Preston Gallagher used his executive power to legalize a criminal transaction. It was all captured perfectly on the digital recorder resting inches from his mouth in my jacket pocket. I picked up the pen. I looked at the signature line. Then I looked back at my son. You know, Julian, I said, my voice suddenly dropping its manufactured tremor. Your mother always said you were too arrogant for your own good. She said one day your mouth was going to write a check your bank account could not cash. Julian frowned, confused by the sudden shift in my tone. What are you talking about? Just sign the document. I dropped the pen onto the table. I stood up, my spine perfectly straight. I did not look like a broken old man anymore. I looked down at him with the absolute authority of a federal examiner closing a terminal audit. I am not signing anything, I said calmly. And you can keep your cheap apartment. I prefer the view from my truck. I turned and walked away before Julian could process what had just happened. He yelled my name across the diner, but I did not stop. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped back out onto the street. The digital recorder was burning a hole in my pocket. I had the confession. Now I just needed the paper trail to match it. I walked briskly toward the parking lot where I had left my Ford pickup. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a sharp clarity that I had not felt since my days raiding corrupt savings and loans institutions in the 90s. But my 30 years of federal fieldwork had taught me to never let a victory blind me to my surroundings. You never walk away from a hostile target without checking your six. I paused at the corner of the brick building, pretending to tie my shoe. I used the reflection of the diner large plate glass window to scan the street behind me. My blood ran cold. Parked illegally in the red zone across the street was a heavily tinted black Lincoln Town Car. It had not been there when I walked into the diner. Standing by the open driver's side door was a massive, thick-necked white man wearing a cheap leather jacket. He was staring directly at me. In the passenger seat, I could barely make out the silhouette of a second man speaking rapidly into a cell phone. These were not Julian typical real estate buddies. These were not corporate lawyers. These men had the distinct heavy-set posture of professional debt collectors. The kind of men who worked off the books for corrupt banking executives to ensure that messy loose ends stayed permanently tied. Preston Gallagher was not just relying on legal waivers to protect his $4 million embezzlement scheme. He knew that Julian was weak, and he knew that a desperate man with nothing to lose was a dangerous liability. Preston had sent his muscle to watch the meeting, and now that I had refused to sign the liability waiver, I was no longer just a displaced homeowner. I was an active threat to a federal banking conspiracy. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes forward. I did not run. Running triggers the predator instinct. I walked at a steady, measured pace toward my truck, my mind working furiously. They had eyes on me. They knew what vehicle I was driving. If I went to the local police station right now, they would intercept me before I ever reached the front desk. If I tried to hide in a motel, they would drag me out in the middle of the night. Preston had the money and the resources to hunt me down anywhere in the city. I reached my truck, unlocked the door, and climbed inside. I glanced in the side mirror. The black Lincoln had just pulled out of the red zone and was slowly cruising down the street, keeping a distance of 2 blocks. They were tailing me. I put the key in the ignition and started the engine. The situation had escalated from a white-collar financial fraud to a life-or-death hunt. I was an old man being tracked by violent criminals hired by a bank executive. I could not fight them with my fists. I had to fight them with my mind. I needed to get inside Oakmont Regional Bank. I needed to find a way to tear Preston's impenetrable paper trail to shreds before his thugs caught up to me. But you cannot storm a heavily guarded bank vault from the outside. You have to open it from the inside, and I knew exactly how to find the key. I put the truck in drive and pulled out into the traffic, leading the wolves straight into the heart of the city. I watched the black Lincoln Town Car in my rearview mirror. The 2 debt collectors inside thought they were tracking a scared, senile old man. They did not know that a federal bank examiner spends half his career learning how to avoid hostile targets. I navigated the heavy downtown Chicago traffic, keeping my speed completely average. I needed a bottleneck. I saw the glowing sign of the elevated train station 3 blocks ahead. The traffic light turned yellow. I slammed on the brakes, jerking the old Ford pickup into a tight parallel parking spot between 2 delivery trucks. Before the Lincoln could weave through the intersection to catch up, I was already out of the cab. I pulled my baseball cap down low, gripped my wooden cane, and blended into the dense crowd of commuters pouring down the concrete stairs into the subway station. I caught the express train just as the doors were sliding shut, leaving Preston Gallagher and his hired muscles stranded on the platform above. I had bought myself a few precious hours, but I was still locked on the outside of the fortress. Oakmont Regional Bank was a fortress of glass and marble in the financial district. I could not walk through those revolving doors. The moment I handed over my ID to the security desk, Preston would have me thrown out or arrested for trespassing. I needed a ghost inside the machine. I sat at a small cafe directly across the street, nursing a black coffee, watching the bank lobby through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the lobby erupted in a spectacle of corporate cruelty. Through the glass, I watched a tall, slick white man in a custom-tailored suit march into the center of the customer service floor. It was Preston Gallagher. Even from across the street, I could feel the arrogance radiating off him. He was holding a thick, red loan file. Following closely behind him was a young African-American woman in a modest business suit. She looked terrified. Preston stopped in the middle of the lobby, turned around, and began screaming at her. He threw the red file onto the marble floor, pointing his finger directly at her face. The security guards and the bank tellers just watched in silence. He was publicly humiliating her, establishing a narrative for everyone in the room to see. When he stormed off to the executive elevators, the young woman knelt on the floor, gathering the scattered papers with trembling hands. I recognized the maneuver instantly. I had seen corrupt bank executives pull this exact stunt 100 times. You do not scream at an employee in the middle of a crowded lobby unless you are building a public alibi. Preston was not just firing her, he was framing her. He was setting her up to be the designated fall guy for a toxic loan portfolio. She was the sacrificial lamb, just like me. I waited until the bank closed. I watched the employee exit in the back alley. At 6 o'clock, the young woman walked out. Her shoulders were slumped and she was holding a cardboard box of her personal belongings. She wiped a tear from her cheek as she walked toward the adjacent concrete parking garage. I followed her, keeping my footsteps perfectly silent against the pavement. The garage was cold, dark, and mostly empty. She reached a compact sedan and fumbled with her car keys. I stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. "Miss Jackson," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. I read her name off the brass plaque she was still wearing on her lapel. Maya Jackson. She jumped, dropping her keys, her eyes wide with panic. She clutched her cardboard box to her chest like a shield. "Who are you?" she stammered, looking around the empty garage for help. "What do you want?" I did not move any closer. I kept my hands visible, resting on the handle of my cane. "I am the man who knows exactly why Preston Gallagher humiliated you in the lobby today," I told her. "I know he is preparing to blame you for a string of fraudulent commercial loans, and I know that if you do not listen to me right now, you are going to spend the next 10 years in a federal women penitentiary." Maya froze. The color drained from her face. "How do you know that?" she whispered. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a folded paper napkin. While sitting in the cafe, I had mapped out the exact financial architecture of a standard executive scapegoat scheme. I held it out to her. "I spent 30 years as a senior examiner for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation," I explained. "Look at the math on that napkin, Maya. Preston uses your login credentials to bypass the automated underwriting software. He approves high-risk commercial loans to his personal shell companies, but the digital signature on the approval matrix belongs to you. When the federal auditors eventually arrive, Preston will point to your employee ID and claim you were running a rogue embezzlement operation. The red file he threw at you today was the bait. He is building the paper trail to destroy your life." Maya slowly reached out and took the napkin. She read the handwritten numbers and the compliance codes I had jotted down. I watched her eyes dart back and forth across the paper. She was a loan officer. She understood the math. She realized I was telling her the exact, terrifying truth. Her hands started to shake. She looked up at me, tears welling in her eyes again, but this time they were tears of pure terror. "I never authorized those loans," she cried softly. "He told me he needed my terminal for an executive override. He is the vice president. I had to give him my terminal. I did not know he was attaching my name to the disbursements. What do I do? He has all the leverage." "No, he does not," I said, my voice hardening with absolute authority. "I have the leverage, but I need the ammunition." I stepped closer, looking her dead in the eye. "Preston Gallagher orchestrated a fraudulent $4 million commercial loan using my home as collateral to save his sister failing logistics company. He evicted me last night. I need the original physical origination file for the Harrison Cole property. I need the wet ink signatures and the internal routing slips. You go back into that bank, you bring me that file, and I will personally deliver the evidence to the regional director of the FDIC. I will give you blanket federal whistleblower immunity, and I will make sure Preston leaves that bank in handcuffs." Maya stared at me. She was weighing her life, her freedom, and her career. She was a smart girl, but she was terrified of crossing an executive with that much power. Before she could answer, the sharp, shrill vibration of a pager echoed in the quiet garage. It was coming from the pocket of her blazer. Maya pulled the pager out. She looked at the small digital screen. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with absolute panic. "It is Preston," she whispered, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "He just messaged me. He says I cannot leave yet. He ordered me to go down to the basement archives right now." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What does he want you to do, Maya?" She turned the pager around so I could see the glowing green screen. The text was short, brutal, and completely unambiguous. "Need you to shred the physical file for the Cole Logistics account tonight. No exceptions. Do it now. The timeline had just vanished. Preston knew I was a loose end. He knew I had refused to sign the liability waiver this morning. He was not waiting for his thugs to find me. He was destroying the paper trail tonight. If that physical file went through the industrial shredder, the wet ink proof of his forgery would be gone forever. He would be untouchable. Victoria would be safe, and I would die a homeless man on the streets of Chicago. We do not have until tomorrow, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous gravelly whisper. We have to steal that file right now. Maya looked at the dark stairwell leading back into the bank. She was trembling, but I saw a spark of defiance ignite in her eyes. She was done being the victim. I stood with Maya in the damp concrete shadows of the parking garage. The sun had completely set, leaving the financial district bathed in the cold, sickly glow of amber streetlights. I handed her a cheap plastic two-way radio I had just bought from a corner convenience store. I kept the other one tight in my right fist. I told her the physical file was a good start, but a smart defense lawyer could claim a paper document was planted or altered. We needed the digital footprint. We needed the exact timestamp showing Preston Gallagher bypassing the underwriting software on his executive terminal. Maya took a deep, shaky breath. She clipped the radio to her belt, smoothed out her blazer, and walked back toward the employee entrance of Oakmont Regional Bank. I moved to the narrow, pitch-black service alley that ran directly behind the building. I leaned my back against the cold brick wall, pressing the radio to my ear, waiting in the dark. "Harry, I am in." Maya's voice crackled through the small speaker a few minutes later. "The night guard bought my story about leaving my apartment keys at my desk. The lobby is completely empty. I told her to skip the basement archives for now and head straight up to the second-floor loan department. The physical shredding order was a distraction. Preston wanted her in the basement so she would not look at the digital servers where the real crime was permanently logged." Maya moved quietly up the back stairs. Over the radio, I could hear her quick, shallow breathing. She reached her cubicle and powered on her computer. She slipped the blank USB drive I had given her into the side port of the machine. "I am at the login screen," she whispered. I walked her through the hidden backdoor protocols I had used for decades during federal bank audits. I told her to bypass the standard employee interface and open the raw data registry. "Search for Cole Logistics," I ordered. "Look for the origination timestamp and the authorization signature line." I heard the rapid clicking of her keyboard. Then a sudden sharp gasp came over the radio. "I found it," Maya said, her voice shaking violently. "But Harry, something is wrong. The file has a bright red padlock icon next to it. It is heavily restricted." I knew exactly what that meant. "Download it anyway," I commanded. "Copy the entire registry to the drive right now." I heard the click of the computer mouse. A second later, a loud, piercing electronic siren blared through her end of the radio. It was not a building fire alarm. It was a localized security breach siren coming directly from her terminal. "Harry," she screamed over the deafening noise. A warning just popped up on the center of my screen. It says Executive Override Alert. Preston Gallagher has been notified. The download is at 20%. My blood ran cold. Preston had laid a digital trap. He knew the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation would eventually come looking for that specific file, so he attached a silent tripwire to the data code. The moment anyone tried to access the digital footprint, the system alerted him directly on his phone. And because Preston was a paranoid bank executive manipulating $4 million of stolen money, he was probably still in the executive suites on the top floor working late to cover his tracks. "Get out of there, Maya," I shouted into the radio. "Pull the drive out and run. Leave the building immediately." "No," she yelled back, panic and pure defiance mixing in her voice. "It is at 60%. I am not going to a federal prison for him. 80%. Over the open microphone, I heard the heavy thud of the stairwell doors slamming open on the second floor. I heard the aggressive, booming voice of Preston Gallagher yelling for the night security guards to lock down the entire level. He was screaming that there was corporate espionage in progress. They were coming right for her. 95%, Maya screamed. 100. "I have it." I pulled the drive. "They are in the hallway," I yelled. "You cannot use the elevators. You cannot use the stairs. They will trap you in the lobby. Go to the main server room at the very end of the hall." I heard her sprinting across the carpeted floor, her breath ragged and loud. She slammed a heavy door shut, and the lock clicked into place. Preston's voice echoed loudly from the other side, pounding his heavy fists against the wood. He was screaming her name, threatening to destroy her life, calling her a thief and a liar. "Harry, I am trapped," Maya cried into the radio, sobbing in terror. "They are bringing a fire extinguisher to break down the doorknob. I cannot get out." Listen to me, and listen very carefully, I said, maintaining absolute icy calm. I used to inspect the architectural blueprints of this building. The server room has an industrial ventilation shaft on the back wall to prevent the machines from overheating. It leads directly out to the service alley where I am standing. Kick the metal grate out and crawl into the duct. Do it right now. I heard the sickening sound of heavy metal crashing against wood. The guards were smashing the door. Then I heard the sharp clang of the metal ventilation grate hitting the server room floor. I am in the duct. Maya gasped, her voice echoing in the tight metallic tin space. It is completely dark. I am crawling toward the exhaust vent. I looked up at the brick wall of the alley. About 15 feet above my head, a large, square exhaust louver was set into the masonry. I saw a pair of hands push desperately against the metal slats. The louver gave way and swung open with a screech. Maya's face appeared in the shadows above me, looking down into the dark alley. Drop the drive, I ordered, stepping directly underneath the vent. She held her hand out over the alley. The small black USB drive plummeted through the cold night air. I reached out and caught it firmly in my palm. The physical proof of my son's betrayal and Preston Gallagher's massive federal fraud was finally in my hands. The weapon I needed to destroy them was secured. Crawl back inside, I told her quietly over the radio. Climb up the internal ladder to the roof access and hide behind the air conditioning units until morning. When the bank opens to the public at 9, walk out the front door with the crowd. They will not search for you in the daylight. I will handle Preston. I pocketed the drive and turned around to walk out of the long, narrow alley. I was going to find a payphone. I was going to call the regional director of the FDIC the second I hit the main street. I was going to burn Oakmont Regional Bank to the ground. But before I could take a single step forward, the entire alley was flooded with blinding high-beam headlights. I threw my arm up to shield my sensitive eyes. The roar of a massive engine echoed violently off the narrow brick walls. At the far end of the alley, completely blocking my only exit to the street, was the black Lincoln Town Car. The exact same car that had been tailing me since the diner this morning. The two professional debt collectors Preston had hired did not lose me at the subway station. They had anticipated my move. They knew a former bank examiner would eventually go for the bank. The engine revved with a deafening, violent roar. The heavy metal grille of the Lincoln lunged forward slightly like a beast preparing to strike. They were not stopping to talk. They were not trying to intimidate me into handing over the drive. They were accelerating. The massive car surged down the narrow alley, its heavy tires screaming and smoking against the wet pavement. It was charging straight at me. I was 73 years old, trapped in a dead-end corridor of solid brick, staring down 2 tons of accelerating steel. Preston Gallagher did not just want to bury the digital evidence. He wanted to bury me right along with it. The roar of the massive engine echoed violently off the narrow brick walls. At the far end of the alley, completely blocking my only exit to the street, was the black Lincoln Town Car. The exact same car that had been tailing me since the diner this morning. The two professional debt collectors Preston had hired did not lose me at the subway station. They had anticipated my move. They knew a former bank examiner would eventually go for the bank. The heavy metal grille of the Lincoln lunged forward like a beast preparing to strike. They were not stopping to talk. They were not trying to intimidate me into handing over the drive. They were accelerating. The massive car surged down the narrow alley with its heavy tires screaming and smoking against the wet pavement. It was charging straight at me. I had fractions of a second to react. I am 73 years old. My knees are worn down from decades of life and my back aches when it rains. But survival instinct does not care about arthritis. When a predator lunges, your body remembers how to move. I threw myself to the left, aiming for a deep recess behind a rusted commercial dumpster. I hit the wet pavement hard just as the massive car roared past me. The driver misjudged the narrow space. The passenger side of the Lincoln scraped violently against the brick wall, sending a shower of orange sparks into the dark air. The side mirror clipped my right arm. The impact was brutal. A blinding flash of pain shot from my shoulder down to my fingertips. The force spun me around and threw me into the filthy puddles behind the dumpster. The Lincoln slammed its brakes, hitting a metal ventilation unit at the far end of the alley with a deafening crash. I heard the transmission grind as the driver frantically tried to throw the heavy car into reverse. I did not wait. I ignored the agonizing pain radiating through my right arm. I scrambled to my feet. My jacket was torn and my arm was bleeding heavily, but my left hand was clenched tight. I still held the black USB drive. I ran toward the street opening as fast as my old legs could carry me. I burst out of the alley and blended instantly into a thick crowd of late-night restaurant workers and tourists leaving a nearby theater. I kept my head down and walked rapidly, losing myself in the sea of people. I did not stop walking until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I made it back to the commercial parking lot where I had left my rusty Ford pickup truck. I unlocked the heavy metal door, climbed inside, and locked it immediately. I slumped against the steering wheel, gasping for air. I turned on the dim dome light and looked at my right arm. A deep, jagged gash was bleeding freely, soaking through the fabric of my jacket. I grabbed a clean rag from the glove compartment and tied it tightly around my arm to stop the bleeding. The pain was sharp and constant, but it brought a terrifying clarity to my mind. Preston Gallagher was no longer just a corrupt bank vice president. He was a desperate and highly dangerous man who had just authorized a violent hit in the middle of downtown Chicago. He knew the data was compromised. He knew his digital fingerprints were on that drive. He would send every thug on his payroll to hunt me down before the sun came up. I could not go to a hospital. I could not go to any hotel inside the city limits. Preston had the money and the connections to track my name across local databases. I put the truck in gear and drove west, heading far out toward the desolate industrial outskirts of the city. I drove for an hour, taking every back road and poorly lit industrial detour I could find to make sure I had no tail. I found a rundown cash-only motel sitting entirely alone on a dark stretch of highway near the freight train yards. The neon sign flickered weakly in the night. The tired desk clerk behind the bulletproof glass did not ask for identification when I slid a $50 bill under the transaction slot. He handed me a brass key attached to a heavy plastic tag. I parked my truck behind the building to keep it hidden from the road. I limped into room number 7. The room smelled of stale smoke and damp carpet. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners. I locked the deadbolt and dragged the heavy wooden dresser in front of the door. I pulled the curtains tight. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress and took a deep breath. The chase was over for tonight. I pulled the small black USB drive from my pocket. It was time to see exactly what Preston Gallagher was willing to kill for. From my canvas duffel bag, I pulled out my old heavy laptop. It was not a modern lightweight machine. It was a sturdy, rugged device loaded with the encrypted analytical software I used during my final years as a senior examiner at the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. I powered it up. The bright screen glowed in the dark and dingy room. I plugged the USB drive into the port. A folder immediately popped up containing the raw, unfiltered origination file for the Harrison Cole property loan. I opened the digital ledger. When you spend your entire life hunting financial criminals, you learn one fundamental rule. You do not look at the money. You look at the movement. Money sitting in a bank account is just a static number. Money in transit tells a detailed story of human greed. I pulled up the primary disbursement record. $4 million. I saw my own forged signature on the collateral agreement. I saw the digital executive override timestamp belonging to Preston Gallagher. He had forced the massive commercial loan through the bank system at 3 a.m. on a Sunday, completely bypassing every automated risk assessment and underwriting protocol his bank had in place. I tracked the destination of the funds. The $4 million was wired directly into the primary operating account of Victoria Failing Logistics Company. That much I already knew. That was the emergency bailout money to hide her massive embezzlement before the state transportation auditors arrived. But as I scrolled down the transaction log, I noticed an anomaly. It was a massive, glaring red flag that any seasoned federal investigator searches for. Less than 12 hours after the $4 million hit Victoria corporate account, a secondary wire transfer was initiated. It was categorized under a vague and highly suspicious heading called International Vendor Services. I ran the routing number through my analytical software. It was not a legitimate vendor. It was a dummy corporation registered to a post office box in Delaware. I pushed deeper into the routing architecture. The Delaware Shell Company was a classic pass-through entity designed to obscure the true owner. But Preston was arrogant. Arrogant men always make lazy mistakes because they believe they are untouchable. He used the exact same registered agent that Oakmont Regional Bank used for their offshore tax compliance. I followed the digital money trail as it left the country. The Delaware Shell Company immediately bounced the funds to an offshore private account in the Cayman Islands. The transferred amount was exactly $2 million, exactly half of the stolen loan value secured by my home. I pulled up the beneficiary details of the Cayman account. The name on the offshore trust was a cryptic alphanumeric code, but the designated primary controller was clear as day. It was Preston Gallagher. I sat back in the cheap motel chair and stared at the glowing screen. The true scope of the crime had just mutated from a local embezzlement cover-up into a massive federal felony. Preston did not just orchestrate this complex bank fraud to save his sister from going to prison. He used his sister and her desperation as a convenient smokescreen to enrich himself. He leveraged the entire value of my home to steal $2 million in clean, untraceable cash for his own offshore retirement fund. This was no longer just internal bank fraud. This was international money laundering. This was a direct violation of the Bank Secrecy Act and a severe breach of federal banking laws. It was a crime that triggers automatic federal intervention and carries mandatory maximum sentencing in a federal penitentiary. I looked at my bleeding arm, and then I looked back at the computer screen. A cold, relentless energy replaced the pain in my body. Preston Gallagher thought he was hunting a helpless, homeless old man. He thought he could run me down in an alley and bury his secrets forever. He did not realize he had just handed the most dangerous federal auditor in Chicago the exact coordinates to destroy his entire life. The hunt had officially reversed. The cold dawn light bled through the cheap stained curtains of the motel room. My right arm throbbed violently. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, tearing a clean strip of cloth from my spare shirt to rewrap the deep gash the Lincoln Town Car had left on my shoulder. The physical pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the cold, calculating fury settling into my bones. I had survived the night. I had the digital evidence of the offshore money laundering. But I needed to know what Preston Gallagher and my son were planning next. I pulled out the cheap burner phone I bought at the convenience store and dialed the number Maya Jackson had given me. She answered on the very first ring, her breath catching in her throat. I asked her if she was safe. She told me she walked out of the bank with the morning crowd just as I instructed, but her voice was shaking. She told me Preston was pacing the executive floor like a caged animal. He knew the data was stolen, but he was acting completely untouchable. Maya said he was loudly boasting on his phone about a massive real estate closing party happening this weekend. I asked her where the party was taking place. When she told me the address, all the air completely vanished from my lungs. It was my address, my home. Maya explained the full scope of their endgame. Preston, Julian, and Victoria had finalized a massive backdoor deal with Apex Development, a ruthless corporate real estate conglomerate. They were not just stealing my house to cover Victoria-embezzled logistics funds. They were going to completely demolish it. They were hosting a grand demolition celebration tomorrow night right in my own backyard to sign the final land transfer over expensive champagne and catered food. My home, the exact place where my late wife Beatrice planted her prized rose bushes, where I measured Julian height on the kitchen door frame every summer, was scheduled to be reduced to rubble on Monday morning. The $4 million fraudulent loan was never meant to be paid back. It was just a temporary bridge loan. The sale of the prime real estate lot to the commercial developers was their grand prize. They were going to erase my entire history and pave over it for a profit. I did not smash the motel mirror in a fit of rage. I did not scream at the ceiling. I opened my encrypted laptop and initiated a highly secure voice-over internet protocol call. I routed the signal through 3 different international proxy servers to ensure absolute anonymity. I dialed a specific classified 10-digit number in Washington, D.C. that completely bypasses all standard government switchboards. It was the direct emergency line to Donovan Carter. Donovan was the former regional director of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. He was a titan in the financial regulatory sector. We had spent 2 decades working side by side, shutting down corrupt banks, seizing illicit assets, and putting white-collar criminals in federal penitentiaries. The phone rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. Donovan Carter speaking. "Donovan, it is Harry Cole," I said, my voice echoing in the hollow motel room. There was a stunned pause on the other end of the line. Harry Donovan said, his professional tone softening into genuine surprise. "I thought you were spending your retirement fishing in peace. What are you doing calling this secure channel?" "I am not fishing, Donovan," I replied coldly. "I am hunting, and I have a massive bleeding target." I laid the entire conspiracy out for him. I did not waste time with emotions. I gave him the pure, unadulterated financial facts. Oakmont Regional Bank, Vice President Preston Gallagher, $4 million in fraudulent commercial loans backed by stolen residential collateral. I explained how Preston used his executive authority to bypass the underwriting software. I told him how $2 million of the stolen equity was instantly laundered through a Delaware shell company and wired directly into Preston's personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands. I told Donovan I had the digital registry, the wet ink timestamps, the internal bank routing slips, and the exact offshore account numbers. I could hear Donovan breathing heavily into the receiver. The silence stretched for a long moment as his veteran auditor brain processed the magnitude of the crime. Harry Donovan finally said, his voice dropping an octave into absolute lethal seriousness. That is a Category 1 federal offense. If what you are saying is backed by hard data, we can shut Oakmont Regional Bank down completely. We can seize their vaults by the end of the week. I told him I had the data securely encrypted on a drive, but I told him I needed the operation done my way. I wanted a total, unannounced surprise audit at Oakmont Regional Bank on Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock. I wanted armed federal examiners chaining the glass doors shut before Preston Gallagher could even finish his morning coffee. I wanted to see his empire burn. Donovan agreed instantly. The FDIC would descend on Oakmont like a sledgehammer. Preston was completely finished. His career and his freedom were officially over. But then Donovan delivered the bitter, unforgiving legal reality of federal jurisdiction. Harry, listen to me very carefully, Donovan warned. We have the authority to seize the bank. We have the jurisdiction to arrest Preston for the international wire fraud. But your son Julian and his wife Victoria are civilians. They are operating behind thick layers of limited liability companies and corporate shields. If we bust Preston on Monday morning, Julian and Victoria will instantly panic. Donovan explained the legal loophole. He said that if Julian and Victoria realized the FBI was coming, they would finalize the land sale to Apex Development, immediately wire their cut of the money offshore, and file for corporate bankruptcy. Because the fraudulent mortgage paperwork currently looked legitimate on the surface, my house would still be legally bulldozed by the conglomerate. If you want to freeze their civilian assets, void the real estate transfer, and save your home, you need to catch them actively participating in the money laundering, Donovan explained. You need to prove that Julian and Victoria are executing the financial crimes themselves. How do I do that? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. Donovan broke down the mechanics of the final transaction. Apex Development was wiring the final payout for the land purchase into Victoria Logistics' account to clear the fraudulent mortgage. To complete the money laundering cycle, Victoria and Julian had to manually execute a secondary wire transfer to push the dirty funds into an untraceable account. They have to manually hit the send button, Harry Donovan said urgently. They are going to execute that final transfer during their closing party tomorrow night. If you can prove they are executing that transfer with full knowledge of the fraud, the Department of Justice can instantly freeze their accounts under the Patriot Act. The collateral pledge will be voided, but we need definitive, undeniable proof of their knowledge and their execution at that exact moment. Otherwise, they walk away filthy rich, and your house becomes a corporate parking lot. The line went dead. I lowered the phone and stared at the blank screen of my laptop. The final devastating wire transfer was happening tomorrow night, at the demolition party, in my own backyard. My son and his wife were going to drink expensive champagne, laugh with their wealthy friends, and push a digital button that would erase my entire legacy forever. I looked at my blood-soaked bandage. I looked around the dark, isolated motel room. I was a 73-year-old man with a target on his back. I was being actively hunted by violent debt collectors. I could not simply walk up to my own front door and ask them to stop. They would have private security. Preston would have his armed thugs waiting in the shadows. I needed to infiltrate an elite corporate party on my own property. I needed to bypass their heavy security slip into the house unnoticed and record them executing a massive federal crime in real time. It was an absolute suicide mission. The odds of a man my age surviving a direct confrontation with a desperate bank executive and his hired muscle were mathematically zero. But an auditor never leaves a discrepancy unresolved, and a father never lets his home be destroyed by the very son he raised to protect it. I packed up my laptop, grabbed my canvas duffel bag, and walked out into the cold night. It was time to prepare for the final judgment. I left the motel room before dawn. The air was freezing and carried the bitter dampness of the nearby freight train yards. I kept to the shadows of the industrial park, walking carefully toward the back lot where I had parked my old Ford pickup. I needed to move the vehicle before the morning commuters arrived. But when I turned the corner of the brick building, my heart turned to lead. My truck was not just vandalized, it was completely obliterated. The windshield was smashed into a million glittering pieces that covered the wet asphalt. All 4 tires were slashed, leaving the heavy metal rims grinding into the dirt. The body panels, the ones I had polished every Sunday while Beatrice tended to her garden, were beaten in with heavy sledgehammers. Sitting on the driver's seat, perfectly visible through the shattered window, was a single heavy steel crowbar. It was a message. Preston Gallagher and his violent debt collectors had found my location in the middle of the night. They wanted me to know they could have easily walked into my cheap motel room and crushed my skull while I slept. They destroyed the truck to send a psychological shockwave. They wanted me terrified. They wanted me to run away and hide in a hole. I stood in the freezing wind and stared at the ruined metal. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, absolute certainty settling into my bones. Preston thought destroying a piece of property would break my spirit. He did not understand that a man who has already lost his wife and his home has absolutely nothing left to fear. He had just confirmed that he was panicked. The hunter was sweating. I turned my back on the truck and walked 3 miles to a busy public library in a neighboring district. A crowded public library is the perfect place to become completely invisible. I used a public computer terminal to send a secure, encrypted email to Maya Jackson. I told her to meet me in the reference section on the 3rd floor. 2 hours later, Maya walked through the heavy glass doors. She was wearing a thick winter coat and dark sunglasses, constantly looking over her shoulder at every sudden sound. She sat down at my table, her hands trembling violently. She looked completely exhausted. She told me she had not slept a single minute. She said Preston was tearing the bank apart this morning, demanding security logs and screaming at the IT department. He knew the data was compromised. I told Maya to take a deep breath. I told her the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was moving in on Monday morning, but we needed to secure the final, most crucial piece of the puzzle tonight. I explained the plan. I told her we were going to infiltrate the elite demolition party at my own house this evening. Maya took off her sunglasses and stared at me like I had lost my mind. She said it was suicide. She said the property would be swarming with private security, high-end catering staff, and dozens of powerful executives. She reminded me that Preston and his thugs would be standing right there. I leaned across the table and told her that was exactly why we could get inside. Wealthy, arrogant people do not look at the help. They look right through them. I told her I knew Victoria had hired a specific luxury catering company because Victoria was obsessed with a particular high society brand. I handed Maya a portion of my cash. I instructed her to go to the catering company headquarters, find a disgruntled employee in the loading bay, and purchase 2 standard service uniforms. While Maya was processing the sheer insanity of the tactical infiltration, she pulled out her phone. She told me I needed to see what Victoria was broadcasting to the world. She turned the screen toward me. It was a social media page. There was a glossy, high-definition photograph of Victoria and my son Julian standing proudly in my front yard. Behind them was the beautiful brick house I had built with decades of sweat and sacrifice. They were holding crystal champagne flutes. The caption underneath the photo made the blood boil in my veins. It read, "Celebrating the end of an era and the beginning of a massive new venture on this historic plot. Out with the old, in with the future." They were gloating. They were dancing on my grave for their corporate sponsors to see. They were treating my legacy like a disposable stepping stone for their fraudulent empire. But looking at that arrogant, self-congratulatory post gave me the exact psychological leverage I needed. I remembered what Donovan Carter from the FDIC had told me. We needed to force Julian and Victoria to execute the offshore wire transfer tonight during the party so the federal task force could catch them actively laundering money. I needed to create a panic so intense that Julian would bypass all logic and force Preston to move the stolen money immediately. I turned back to the public computer terminal. I created an untraceable anonymous email account routing the signal through a dozen overseas proxy servers to ensure absolute anonymity. I drafted a single, perfectly calculated message. I addressed it directly to Julian's personal business email account. I did not make elaborate threats. I did not curse or scream. I simply typed one sentence. I know the $4 million commercial loan is completely fake and the FDIC is currently watching Oakmont Regional Bank. I hit send. I knew my son better than anyone else in the world. I knew his deep-seated weaknesses. Julian liked to play the confident, powerful real estate executive, but underneath the expensive suits and the arrogant smile, he was a coward who folded under the slightest pressure. The moment he read that email on his phone, he would not stop to think logically. He would not assume it was a bluff. He would assume the federal government was already marching toward his front door. The carefully constructed walls of his criminal conspiracy would instantly collapse inside his mind. I explained to Maya exactly what was going to happen next. I told her Julian would call Preston in a blind, hysterical panic. Preston would try to calm him down, but Julian would demand immediate action. Julian would insist that the final payout from the Apex Development land sale be instantly wired to their offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands the very second the deal was signed at the party tonight. Julian would threaten to expose the entire operation if Preston did not comply. He would force the money laundering transaction out into the open, executing the transfer on his own laptop right there at the party, exactly where the federal task force needed it to be. Maya looked at the computer screen, then looked back at me. The terror in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a cold, sharp determination. She understood the brilliance of the psychological trap. We were using their own paranoia to force them into a federal snare. She stood up from the library table, grabbed her heavy coat, and told me she was going to get the catering uniforms. She said she would meet me at a designated rendezvous point 3 blocks away from my house at 7 o'clock tonight. I watched her walk out of the library. I leaned back in the uncomfortable wooden chair. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Tonight I was going back to the home I built. But I was not going back as a father, and I was not going back as a victim. I was going back as the architect of their absolute destruction. I met Maya at 7 o'clock, exactly 3 blocks away from the property. She was waiting in a rented sedan holding 2 plastic dry cleaning bags. We did not speak much. We slipped into the back seat and changed into the crisp white button-down shirts, black slacks, and dark waist aprons of the luxury catering company. I pulled a black service cap down low over my eyes. It cast a deep shadow over my face. I looked at my reflection in the car window. I did not look like Harrison Cole, the proud homeowner. I looked like an invisible servant. That was exactly what I needed. We walked the 3 blocks to my street. The neighborhood was lined with expensive luxury vehicles. Valets were running back and forth. The heavy iron gates of my home stood wide open, welcoming a parade of corporate vultures. We walked through the service entrance on the side of the property. The moment I stepped into the backyard, my breath caught in my throat. This was the garden my late wife Beatrice and I had cultivated for 30 years. She used to spend her Sunday mornings on her knees in the dirt, planting vibrant red roses and delicate hydrangeas. Now the garden was completely unrecognizable. The beautiful flower beds had been brutally trampled and covered with temporary wooden decking to support a massive white party tent. Blinding strobe lights were bolted to the old oak tree I had planted when Julian was just a boy. A loud thumping bass from a hired DJ drowned out the natural quiet of the evening. Waiters carried silver trays of expensive caviar and imported champagne to groups of laughing wealthy executives. It was a vulgar display of stolen money. It was a celebration of my destruction happening right on top of my wife and her beautiful memory. I felt a surge of pure anger rise in my chest, but I forced it back down. I was a 73-year-old former federal bank examiner on a mission. Anger makes you careless. Cold calculation gets the job done. I kept my head down and picked up an empty silver tray from a clearing station. Maya did the same. We separated, moving silently through the crowd like ghosts. Wealthy and arrogant people do not look at the help. They look right through them. I scanned the faces of the guests. I saw local politicians, real estate developers, and commercial bankers. Then I saw my son. Julian was standing near the outdoor bar, but he was absolutely not celebrating. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. He was sweating profusely, checking his cell phone every 5 seconds and wiping his forehead with a cocktail napkin. The anonymous email I sent him from the public library had completely shattered his nerves. He was terrified that the federal government was watching. He thought the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation was already building a case against him. He did not know the federal government was currently holding a silver tray just 10 feet away from him. I needed to get inside the main house. I caught Maya's eye across the crowded patio. I gave her a subtle nod. She intentionally bumped into a wealthy guest, spilling a tray of empty champagne flutes onto the stone pavers. The sudden crash of breaking glass drew the immediate attention of the private security guards and the party planners. While they rushed over to scold her and clean up the mess, I slipped quietly through the heavy glass sliding doors into the living room. The interior of the house hit me much harder than the garden. Victoria had completely erased our family history. The warm cherry wood floors I had polished for decades were covered by cheap, gaudy white rugs. The walls where we used to hang Julian childhood portraits and our wedding photos were painted a cold, sterile gray and plastered with rented modern art. The antique grandfather clock that belonged to my father was gone, replaced by a flashy mirrored liquor cabinet. They had gutted the soul of my home to make it look like a cheap corporate waiting room. My right arm throbbed in pain from the car strike in the alley, but the ache in my heart was much worse. I swallowed the grief and focused on the mission. I walked swiftly down the hallway to the back of the house. I stopped in front of the heavy oak door of my old study. This was my sanctuary. This was where I used to sit in my leather chair reading financial reports and smoking my evening pipe. I turned the brass knob and stepped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the patio lights filtering through the window blinds. Julian had converted my study into his temporary real estate command center. My beautiful mahogany desk was buried under stacks of architectural blueprints and land survey reports for the Apex Development conglomerate. Sitting on the edge of the desk was the main wireless internet router for the house. This was the target. Donovan Carter from the FDIC had explained that to legally freeze their assets, we needed to capture the exact digital packet data of the offshore wire transfer the very second Julian executed it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black data interception device I had acquired through my old agency contacts. It was no larger than a flash drive, but it was capable of cloning every keystroke and IP address routed through that specific network. I crouched behind the desk and located the primary data port on the back of the router. My hands were shaking slightly. It was not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline coursing through my old veins. I plugged the interception device into the port. A tiny green light began to blink rapidly. It was syncing with the network. I needed exactly 60 seconds for the federal tracking software to fully establish a secure connection to the FDIC servers in Washington. I watched the green light flash, counting the seconds in my head. 10, 20, 30. At 40 seconds, I heard a sound that made my blood run absolutely cold. Footsteps. Heavy, urgent footsteps were marching rapidly down the hardwood hallway, heading directly toward the study. Then I heard the sharp, angry voice of Preston Gallagher echoing through the corridor, followed immediately by the frantic, high-pitched voice of Victoria. They were arguing bitterly. "I am telling you, Preston, my husband is losing his mind out there," Victoria hissed as her footsteps drew closer to the door. "Julian received some anonymous email today, and now he is demanding we wire the Apex money to the Caymans right now before the bank closes the transfer window." "Do not tell me how to run my operation," Victoria Preston snapped back as their footsteps stopped right outside the study door. "I am the one who authorized the $4 million loan. I am the one who cleans up the messes. Let me see his laptop, and I will make the transfer myself." The green light on the tracking device turned solid. The connection was established. But I had no time to pull my hand back and stand up. The heavy brass doorknob began to turn. The door was swinging open. I threw myself backwards silently, rolling across the carpet toward the large wooden closet built into the corner of the room. I slipped inside the dark closet and pulled the louvered doors shut just as the bright overhead lights of the study flicked on. I held my breath, pressing my back against the wall, surrounded by Victoria expensive winter coats. My injured arm burned with white-hot pain from the sudden movement. Through the narrow wooden slats of the closet door, I watched Preston and Victoria walk right into the center of the room. They had absolutely no idea that a federal trap had just been armed, and the man they threw out into the rain was standing just a few feet away, watching their every move. I stood completely frozen in the dark. The closet smelled of expensive leather and designer perfumes. It was a smell that did not belong in my home. This closet used to hold my winter coats and the beautiful quilts my late wife Beatrice used to make. Now it was just another storage space for the luxury items Victoria had bought with my stolen equity. My right arm was on fire from the deep gash the Lincoln Town Car had left on my shoulder, but I forced my breathing to slow down. I ignored the throbbing pain and focused entirely on the room outside. Through the narrow wooden slats of the closet door, I had a perfect view of my old study. Preston Gallagher and Victoria walked into the room and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them. The loud thud of the door closing sealed us together in the soundproof space. I carefully reached into my vest pocket with my left hand and pulled out the digital voice recorder. I pressed the record button. The small red light blinked in the darkness like a solitary beacon of truth. I was a ghost in my own home, recording the final chapter of their criminal empire. Victoria crossed her arms and glared at her older brother. She was pacing back and forth, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor just beyond the edge of the cheap gray rug they had brought in. She told him Julian was out there acting like a complete lunatic in front of their most important investors. She said Julian received an anonymous email claiming the federal government was watching the bank, and now he wanted to cancel the demolition party and run away. Preston did not look sympathetic. He looked like a man standing on a live landmine. He ran his hands through his slicked back hair and turned to face his sister. His face was pale and a thick sheen of sweat covered his forehead. He did not look like the arrogant bank vice president who had thrown me out into the rain. He looked terrified. He told Victoria that Julian was not crazy and that the anonymous email was just the tip of a massive, terrifying iceberg. Preston lowered his voice, but I could hear every single word perfectly in the quiet room. He said the internal compliance software at Oakmont Regional Bank had thrown a massive red flag this morning. He said someone from the outside had pinged the highly restricted registry for the Harrison Cole property loan. He said the digital file had been cloned. Victoria gasped loudly. She covered her mouth with her hand and asked him who was looking at the file. She asked if it was the local police or the state auditors. Preston shook his head. He said he was terrified it was the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. He told her the FDIC had a specific way of sniffing out bad paper before local authorities even knew a financial crime was committed. He said he had seen federal examiners walk into banks on a Monday morning and chain the doors shut within 10 minutes. He said if the FDIC looked at the data, they would see the $4 million loan was completely fraudulent. They would see his digital signature bypassing the automated underwriting protocols, and they would see the forged collateral pledge. Victoria started to panic. Her voice went high and shrill, cutting through the room like a siren. She told Preston he promised her the plan was absolutely foolproof. She said he promised they would take the old African-American man house, pay off her embezzled logistics accounts, and walk away millions of dollars richer without anyone asking questions. She blamed Preston for being sloppy. She said he was supposed to be the financial genius and now he was dragging her down with him. Preston stopped pacing. The tension in the room snapped like a dry branch under a heavy boot. He closed the distance between them in 2 massive strides and raised his hand. He slapped Victoria across the face with brutal, devastating force. The sharp crack of his palm striking her cheek echoed like a gunshot in the study. Victoria stumbled backward, crashing into the edge of my old mahogany desk. She cried out in shock, holding her hand to her face and staring at her brother in absolute disbelief. Preston pointed a shaking finger directly at her face. He told her to shut her mouth right now. He said he risked his entire lucrative career as a bank vice president to save her from going to a federal prison. He reminded her that she was the one who stole millions of dollars from her own corporate clients to fund her lavish lifestyle and buy expensive cars. He said he used the old man as a sacrificial lamb because she was too stupid and careless to manage her own corporate books. He told her he was not going to let her ungrateful whining drag him into a massive federal indictment. I stood in the dark closet recording every single word on the digital device. It was the absolute holy grail of criminal confessions. Preston had just laid out the entire timeline, the motive and the execution of the federal bank fraud. He admitted to the embezzlement. He admitted to the forged collateral. And he admitted he was terrified of the FDIC. The audio recording resting in my palm was enough to put them both away in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. Preston turned his back on his crying sister and walked over to my desk. Julian had left his silver laptop open and running. Preston sat down in the leather chair and cracked his knuckles. He began typing rapidly. He told Victoria to stop crying and pay attention to the screen. He said they were completely out of time. He said they could not afford to wait for the real estate developers to finalize the demolition paperwork next week. He said he was going to manually push the final wire transfer right now using Julian access codes. He was going to move the Apex Development funds directly into his offshore Cayman Islands account, and they were all getting on a private chartered plane by tomorrow afternoon. I peered through the wooden slats and watched the tiny green light on my tracking device blinking steadily from the back of the internet router. It was working flawlessly. The moment Preston hit the execute button on that offshore wire transfer, the federal tracking software would capture the digital packets. It would lock the money in transit and give the Department of Justice the real-time, undeniable evidence they needed to freeze every asset these criminals owned. Preston's fingers flew across the keyboard. He read the offshore routing numbers out loud as he typed them, verifying the destination. It was a symphony of self-destruction. I just needed to remain perfectly silent for 1 more minute. I just needed to let him finish the transaction. Then my chest began to vibrate violently. It was not a metaphor. It was a physical, mechanical vibration deep inside the breast pocket of my catering uniform. It was my burner phone. I had set a daily recurring alarm on the phone to remind me to take my blood pressure medication at exactly 8:30 every evening. I had completely forgotten to disable the alarm when I bought the phone at the convenience store. The heavy, aggressive buzzing sound was muffled slightly by my jacket. but in the dead silence of the study it sounded like a jackhammer tearing through concrete. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Preston stopped typing instantly. His hands hovered frozen over the laptop keyboard. Victoria stopped crying and looked around the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner. "What is that sound?" Preston asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous cold whisper. I pressed my good hand desperately against my chest, trying to muffle the phone. I fumbled frantically with the buttons through the fabric, trying to silence the mechanical alarm. My heart was pounding so hard I thought my ribs would crack under the pressure. I managed to locate the power button and pressed it hard. The buzzing stopped abruptly. The room fell back into a suffocating, terrifying silence. But it was too late. The damage was done. The location of the noise had been pinpointed. Preston slowly stood up from the mahogany desk. He did not look at Victoria. He did not look at the glowing computer screen. His eyes were locked directly on the louvered wooden doors of the closet where I was hiding. He knew someone was inside the room. He knew someone had been listening to his entire confession. Preston reached behind his back, sliding his right hand under his expensive tailored suit jacket. When his hand reappeared, he was gripping a compact black handgun. The cold metal gleamed menacingly in the dim light of the study. He thumbed the safety off with a sharp metallic click that echoed across the room. Victoria gasped when she saw the weapon. She took a step back, pressing herself against the wall, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Preston held up his free hand, signaling her to remain completely silent. He took a slow, deliberate step toward the closet, then another. He held the gun out in front of him, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He was a cornered animal with millions of stolen dollars on the line, and he was perfectly willing to murder whoever was standing on the other side of those wooden doors. I was 73 years old, trapped in a dark, confined box with absolutely nowhere to run. I had the digital tracking device capturing the wire transfer, and I had the audio confession safely in my hand. I had everything I needed to destroy their empire, but I was about to be executed in my own home by the man who stole it from me. Preston took another heavy step, pressing his expensive shoes into the carpet. The brass handle of the closet door was less than 3 feet away from his hand. I watched the shadow of Preston Gallagher fall across the narrow wooden slats of the closet door. The heavy thud of his expensive shoes against the hardwood floor sounded like a countdown to my own execution. I am 73 years old. I have stared down cartel money launderers and corrupt Wall Street executives, but I had never looked down the barrel of a loaded gun in my own study. My right arm screamed in agony from the hit and run in the alley, but I locked my muscles tight. I held the digital voice recorder in my left hand. If he opened that door, I was going to die, but the recording of his confession would survive. He took another step. I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing. He was terrified, and a terrified man with a gun is the most dangerous creature on earth. His pale hand reached out. His fingers wrapped tightly around the cool brass doorknob of the closet. He began to turn it. The brass mechanism clicked softly in the suffocating silence of the room. I braced myself for the blinding light and the deafening crack of a gunshot, but the gunshot never came. Instead, a catastrophic, deafening explosion of shattering crystal ripped through the heavy oak door of the study. It sounded like a bomb had gone off right in the middle of the hallway. The noise was followed immediately by the terrified screams of the wealthy guests and the frantic shouting of the private security guards. The sheer volume of the crash shook the walls of the house. Preston violently jerked his hand away from the closet doorknob. He spun around wildly, aiming his gun at the closed study door. Victoria let out a high-pitched shriek and covered her ears. "What was that?" she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Is it the police?" she asked, stepping backward. Preston hesitated for a fraction of a second. His paranoid mind was racing, trying to calculate if the federal agents had just breached the front gates, or if his demolition party was under attack by some unknown threat. He shoved the black handgun back under his tailored suit jacket. "Stay here," he barked at Victoria. "Do not touch the laptop. Do not touch anything." Preston tore the study door open and sprinted out into the hallway, heading straight for the source of the chaos. Victoria stood frozen for a moment before her own panic overtook her, and she ran out right behind her brother, leaving the heavy oak door wide open. I stood in the dark closet, letting out a long, shaky breath. Maya Jackson had delivered an absolute miracle. I knew exactly what she had done. I had seen the massive 10-tier champagne tower the catering company had built near the grand entrance when we sneaked in. She had deliberately pushed it over, creating a spectacular, devastating distraction that drew every single eye in the house, including the man who was about to murder me. I pushed the louvered doors open and stepped out into the bright light of the study. I did not have time to sit down and rest my aching bones. I rushed over to the mahogany desk. Julian's laptop was still glowing brightly. Preston had already hit the execute button on the offshore wire transfer right before my phone alarm went off. The screen displayed a loading bar with the words "Processing International Transaction." I dropped to my knees and checked the back of the internet router. The small data interception device I had plugged in was glowing a steady, brilliant green. It was successfully cloning the digital packets and routing them directly to the federal servers. I pulled myself up and grabbed my burner phone from my vest pocket, making absolutely sure the alarm was permanently disabled. I opened the secure messaging application on the burner phone. A heavily encrypted text message from Donovan Carter in Washington was waiting for me. The text was short, precise, and carried the full, terrifying weight of the United States government. It read, "Data packets received and verified. The offshore wire transfer of $4 million to the Cayman Islands has been successfully intercepted in transit. The banking nodes require exactly 10 minutes to clear the international clearinghouse. We have a 10-minute countdown until the money laundering cycle is permanently locked. The federal task force has completely surrounded the perimeter of the property. We have 40 armed agents waiting in the shadows outside the gates. We are holding position and awaiting your final signal to breach." I stared at the glowing screen of the phone. The magnitude of the situation settled over me like a heavy winter coat. Just 24 hours ago, I was standing in the pouring rain with a canvas duffel bag watching my son and his arrogant wife throw me out into the street. I was a homeless, forgotten old man sleeping in a freezing pickup truck. I was hunted by violent thugs and forced to hide in the shadows of the city I helped protect. Now I was holding the leash to a massive federal strike team. 40 armed agents were crouching in the dark outside my iron gates, waiting for an old African-American man to give them the command to destroy a multi-million-dollar banking conspiracy. I looked at the laptop screen. The processing bar was slowly inching forward. 9 minutes left. The trap was fully armed, but I needed to make sure Julian and Victoria were standing right in the center of it when it snapped shut. I needed them to confess their knowledge of the wire transfer in front of their wealthy guests, so there could be no doubt, no legal loopholes, and no high-priced defense attorneys who could twist the narrative and save them from a federal prison sentence. I reached down and carefully unplugged the tracking device from the router, hiding it safely in my pocket right next to the digital voice recorder. I had the undeniable proof of Preston confessing to the entire scheme, and I had the digital footprint of the stolen money moving across international borders. I smoothed out the wrinkles in my catering uniform. I adjusted the black service cap, pulling it low over my eyes once again. My right arm was throbbing with a dull, relentless ache, but I ignored it completely. I walked out of the study and stepped into the long hallway. The house was in total uproar. Guests were murmuring in shocked tones, holding their empty glasses. I walked toward the grand foyer. There, in the center of the marble floor, was a magnificent disaster. Thousands of shards of broken crystal were scattered across the expensive rugs, mixed with gallons of imported vintage champagne. Maya was standing in the middle of the wreckage, holding a silver serving tray, acting perfectly horrified and apologetic. She looked like a clumsy server who had just made the biggest mistake of her life. 2 private security guards were yelling at her while the catering manager looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Preston and Victoria were standing near the edge of the mess, completely focused on the broken glass. They were visibly relieved that it was just a catering accident and not a team of federal agents kicking down the heavy oak doors. Julian came running in from the patio, looking even more panicked than before, asking what happened. Preston grabbed Julian by the arm and pulled him close, whispering angrily into his ear. I could read Preston's lips. He was telling Julian that the money was moving and they needed to get back to the party and act normal until the transfer cleared the international nodes. They thought they had survived the night. They thought the loud crash was the worst thing that was going to happen to them at this party. They had no idea the clock was ticking down to their absolute ruin. 8 minutes left. I caught Maya's eye through the chaotic crowd. She looked terrified, but she held her ground beautifully. I gave her a nearly imperceptible nod, acknowledging her bravery. She had risked her freedom and her life to save me and keep this mission alive. I turned away from the foyer and walked toward the massive glass doors leading out to the backyard patio. The DJ had turned the music back up, trying to restore the celebratory mood of the demolition party. Waiters were rushing out to serve more drinks to the unsettled guests to calm their nerves. I blended right back into the flow of the catering staff, carrying an empty tray. I stepped out into the cool night air. The heavy bass of the music vibrated in my chest. I looked at the massive white party tent erected over my wife's beautiful garden. I looked at the rich, powerful people laughing and drinking stolen champagne, completely unaware that they were standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. I walked over to the main audio-visual control table where the DJ was managing the sound and the large projection screen that Julian planned to use for his real estate presentation. I spent 30 years tearing down the false empires of arrogant men. I have seized assets from billionaires and locked the doors on corrupt institutions. But I never imagined I would have to bring the full weight of the federal government crashing down on my own flesh and blood. Julian had chosen greed over his family. He had chosen a quick payout over the father who raised him. He traded his soul for a fraction of dirty money. Now he was going to pay the ultimate price. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold plastic of the voice recorder. The evidence was solid. The perimeter was secured. The federal agents were waiting for my green light. 6 minutes left. I walked closer to the DJ booth, keeping my head down, pretending to clean the empty glasses left by the guests. The grand stage was perfectly set. The audience was captive. All I needed to do was press play. I stood in the shadows near the massive audio-visual control table. The hired DJ was a young kid wearing heavy headphones, completely oblivious to the federal operation unfolding around him. The backyard of my home was packed with the elite of Chicago. The scent of expensive cologne and roasted meats filled the night air. The white party tent glowed brightly under the stage lights. The massive LED projection screen dominated the center of the garden. It was a beautiful, crisp evening, but the atmosphere felt heavy with stolen wealth. Julian walked up the short wooden steps to the crystal podium. He was holding a fresh glass of vintage champagne. He looked terrified just a few minutes ago in the hallway, but the presence of the Apex Development executives seemed to inflate his fragile ego. He thrived on the attention of powerful people. Victoria stood at the front row wearing a stunning designer dress bought with the equity they stole from me. Preston stood right next to her, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He thought the danger had passed. He thought the broken glass in the foyer was the only disaster he had to worry about tonight. Julian tapped the microphone. A sharp feedback whine cut through the garden and the loud crowd fell instantly silent. The DJ lowered the background music. Julian smiled broadly. It was that fake, polished corporate smile I had grown to absolutely despise. He thanked the wealthy investors, the local politicians, and the corporate executives for coming to celebrate the birth of a new era. He raised his glass to the crowd, and they politely raised their glasses back. He told the audience that progress always requires making difficult sacrifices. He pointed at the solid brick walls of my home. He called it a rotting structure. He told the laughing executives that he had finally convinced his senile old father to let go of the past. He said the old man was losing his mind and living in a sad fantasy world. Julian actually stood on the grass my late wife Beatrice used to water every morning and told a crowd of strangers that throwing his own father into the street was an act of mercy. He painted himself as the burdened savior making the hard choices for the sake of urban development. My right arm throbbed violently from the hit-and-run attack, but my heart beat with a cold, steady rhythm. I looked at the countdown on my encrypted burner phone. 4 minutes until the offshore wire transfer permanently cleared the international banking nodes. The trap was fully armed. It was time to spring it. I stepped closer to the DJ table. I bumped into the young kid pretending to clean up some empty cocktail glasses. I mumbled a quick apology. While he was distracted looking the other way, I quickly pulled the main video input cable from his laptop and plugged it directly into my secure encrypted device. I took the audio line and connected it straight into the headphone jack of my digital voice recorder. The transition was smooth and completely unnoticed. On the stage, Julian took a sip of his champagne. He proposed a grand toast to Apex Development and the bright future of commercial real estate in Chicago. He told the audience to turn their attention to the giant projection screen behind him. He said he was going to show them a three-dimensional architectural rendering of the massive luxury complex they were going to build right over the ashes of my ruined life. He picked up his wireless remote and pressed the center button with a dramatic flourish. Julian expected soaring orchestral music and digital buildings sweeping across the screen. He expected applause. I pressed the play button on my device. The massive LED screen flickered brightly in the darkness. It did not show a luxury apartment complex. It showed a stark, bright white financial document. It was 50 feet tall, illuminating the entire garden with the undeniable proof of a massive federal felony. The crowd gasped collectively. A wave of confusion and shock washed over the wealthy guests. There on the massive screen was the highly restricted internal origination file for a $4 million commercial loan. The Apex development executives frowned deeply, setting their expensive champagne glasses down on the tables. They were ruthless corporate sharks, and they instantly recognized a fraudulent loan-to-value ratio when they saw one. The screen clearly displayed my residential property listed as the sole collateral for a massive corporate payout. And right at the bottom of the document, highlighted in glowing red pixels, was the digital authorization signature belonging to Preston Gallagher. Preston went completely pale. All the blood drained from his face in a single second. His jaw dropped open. He recognized his own classified banking screen. He lunged forward, spilling his dark liquor down his expensive tailored suit. Victoria grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with absolute horror. She realized her logistics company account numbers were plastered 50 feet high for the entire city elite to see. On the stage, Julian mashed the button on his wireless remote repeatedly. He was sweating profusely, panic seizing his entire body. He shouted at the DJ to turn the screen off. He yelled that there was a technical malfunction and demanded someone cut the power. He looked like a madman frantically clicking a useless piece of plastic. But the visual evidence was only the beginning of their punishment. I reached down and hit the playback button on my digital voice recorder, sending the audio feed straight into the massive concert speakers surrounding the garden. The crystal clear audio of our conversation at the diner that morning boomed across the silent yard. The volume was deafening. The guests heard my voice first. My voice sounded weak and frightened, asking Julian how the bank took my house when I had no mortgage. I asked him how a $4 million loan was legal. Then the massive speakers blasted Julian's arrogant, cruel response. "Go to the police, Dad. See what happens. You think you can beat us in court." The entire party of powerful elites stood completely paralyzed as Julian's recorded voice echoed off the oak trees. Preston is the vice president of commercial lending at Oakmont. He personally authorized the disbursement. His bank legalized everything. They buried the paper trail so deep you would need a federal subpoena just to see the cover page. You have no money, you have no lawyer, and you signed the collateral pledge with your own hand. Suing is useless. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than lead. The mayor of Chicago, who had been sipping a martini near the front row, slowly backed away from the stage as if Julian was carrying a highly infectious disease. The Apex development executives began whispering furiously to their legal teams. They realized they were not attending a simple real estate closing. They realized they were standing in the very center of a massive money laundering operation. Buying a foreclosed property was just aggressive business. Buying a property seized through an explicit federal bank fraud conspiracy orchestrated by a bank vice president was a guaranteed path to a federal prison sentence. Julian dropped his wireless remote. It clattered loudly against the wooden stage. He looked like a man who had just been hit by a runaway freight train. He stared at the giant screen and then looked out at the sea of disgusted, horrified faces. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. He stammered, trying to say it was a fake recording, a deep fake, an artificial intelligence trick. He begged the Apex executives to listen to him, but nobody believed a single word he said. The audio was too raw and too perfectly matched to the highly classified banking document glowing brightly behind his head. The arrogance in his recorded voice could not be faked. The crowd began to turn on him instantly. I stood in the shadows watching their fraudulent empire crumble into fine dust. The humiliation was absolute and total. They had invited the most powerful people in the city to witness their grand triumph, and instead I had turned every single one of those wealthy guests into federal witnesses. I checked my phone one last time. 2 minutes left until the transfer cleared the international nodes. Julian, Preston, and Victoria were completely exposed to the world. But the public execution was only phase 1. It was time for phase 2. I reached up and pulled off my black catering cap. I reached up and pulled the black catering cap off my head. I let it drop to the grass. I unbuttoned the dark waist apron and let it fall right next to the hat. I was done being an invisible servant in my own backyard. My right arm was throbbing with a burning, relentless pain from where the Lincoln Town Car had struck me in the alley, but I did not let a single ounce of weakness show on my face. I squared my shoulders and stood up to my full height. I am 73 years old. But tonight I carried the absolute authority of a man who had spent 3 decades shutting down the most ruthless financial criminals in the country. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the audio-visual control table and walked directly into the bright, glaring light of the massive white party tent. The garden was in a state of absolute paralysis. Hundreds of the most powerful people in Chicago were standing frozen, staring at the 50-foot-tall bank document glowing on the screen. and listening to the echoes of my son confessing to a massive federal fraud. They were completely silent. The only sound was the soft rustling of the evening wind through the old oak tree and the quiet hum of the massive LED projectors. I walked slowly down the center aisle of the lawn. My worn shoes stepped firmly on the temporary wooden decking they had laid over my late wife's beautiful flower beds. The wealthy guests standing near the back were the first to notice me. They saw an older African-American man in a wrinkled white button-down shirt walking with a slow, deliberate, and terrifying purpose. They looked at my face and then they looked up at the giant screen behind the stage. They recognized me immediately. I was the displaced father. I was the sacrificial lamb whose ruined life had funded their expensive champagne and their catered caviar. The elite crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Politicians, corporate lawyers, and real estate developers took hurried steps backward, giving me a wide, clear path to the front. Nobody said a word. They just watched the ghost of Harrison Cole marching toward the men who murdered his legacy. Julian was still standing on the wooden stage near the shattered remains of his grand presentation. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tailored suit suddenly looking completely ridiculous on his trembling frame. He was frantically trying to signal the private security guards near the edge of the tent, but the guards were thoroughly confused and terrified by the massive banking document displayed on the screen. They were paid to bounce unruly guests, not to interfere in a federal bank fraud conspiracy. Julian turned his head and looked down the center aisle. He saw me walking toward him. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling hand. It hit the wooden stage and shattered into a dozen glittering pieces, splashing expensive vintage wine across his polished leather shoes. All the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified child. His mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He thought I was sleeping in a cardboard box on the south side of the city. He thought his hired thugs had run me down in a dark alley. He never in his wildest nightmares imagined that his old, senile father was the architect of his absolute public destruction. Victoria was standing in the front row right next to the stage. When she followed Julian's terrified gaze and saw me approaching, her knees actually buckled. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into the edge of a catering table. She clutched her expensive diamond necklace, her eyes wide with a pure, unadulterated horror. She knew exactly what this meant. She knew that if I was standing here, I had the original files. She knew her logistics company was entirely finished. I reached the front of the crowd. The Apex Development executives, the men who were planning to bulldoze my home on Monday morning, stared at me with wide eyes. I walked past them without a single glance and climbed the short wooden steps to the stage. Julian backed away from me as if I were a walking inferno. He pressed his back against the giant LED screen, casting a dark shadow over Preston Forged's signature. I did not look at him with anger. I looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor closing a terminal file. I walked over to the crystal podium. I picked up the wireless microphone that Julian had dropped moments before. I tapped it once to make sure the audio feed was still live. The sharp thump echoed perfectly across the silent garden. I looked out at the sea of pale, horrified faces. I looked at the mayor. I looked at the corporate sharks who had come to feed on my carcass. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I said, my deep voice booming across the massive surround sound speakers. "Thank you for gathering here in my backyard to celebrate my son and his magnificent crimes." The crowd let out a collective gasp. A few of the local news reporters who had been invited to cover the real estate launch suddenly realized they were witnessing the financial scandal of the decade. They discreetly pulled out their cell phones and began recording the stage. "I am Harrison Cole." I continued, my voice steady and unforgiving. "Until yesterday evening, I was the sole legal owner of this property. I built this home with my late wife Beatrice over 30 years of honest labor. But my son Julian and his wife Victoria decided that my legacy was worth less than their corporate debt. So they handed me a stack of fake Medicare forms while I was looking for my reading glasses, and they tricked me into signing away my life." I turned and pointed a steady finger directly at Preston Gallagher, who was standing frozen near the edge of the patio. His face was a mask of pure, sweating terror. "And that man right there," I said, projecting my voice to every corner of the property. "Preston Gallagher, the vice president of commercial lending at Oakmont Regional Bank, used his executive authority to bypass federal underwriting laws. He approved a fraudulent $4 million commercial loan using my stolen home as collateral. He wired that money directly into his sister failing logistics company to cover up a massive corporate embezzlement. And just to make sure he got his cut, Preston laundered $2 million of that stolen equity through a Delaware shell company directly into his personal offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The Apex Development executives erupted into furious whispers. The lead developer turned to his legal counsel and aggressively signaled him to completely terminate the land purchase agreement immediately. Buying a foreclosed house was one thing, but buying a property tied to international money laundering and federal wire fraud would destroy their entire conglomerate. The deal was completely dead, and the $4 million loan was a total loss. Preston Gallagher watched his entire lucrative career, his freedom, and his multi-million-dollar offshore retirement fund vanish into thin air. He was a narcissist who had built his life on absolute control and ruthless manipulation. When a man like that loses everything in the blink of an eye, his brain simply snaps. The polished corporate executive died, and a violent, desperate animal took his place. Preston's face twisted into a mask of pure, blinding rage. He shoved his way through the crowd of wealthy guests, knocking a prominent city councilman to the ground. He stormed toward the front of the stage, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Shut your mouth, you lying old fool!" Preston roared, spit flying from his lips. He pointed a shaking finger at the private security guards standing near the catering tents. "Arrest this crazy old man right now," he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "He is a delusional homeless person. He is trespassing on private property. He broke in here and hacked the computers. Grab him and throw him out into the street." The private security guards took a few hesitant steps forward, but they did not charge the stage. They looked at the giant 50-foot bank document glowing on the screen behind me. They looked at the angry, terrified faces of the elite guests. They knew better than to lay hands on an old man who was actively exposing a federal bank fraud in front of the mayor of Chicago. They froze in their tracks, completely abandoning their arrogant employer. Preston realized nobody was going to help him. He realized the walls were rapidly closing in. He looked at me standing calmly behind the podium, and his mind completely fractured. He refused to be outsmarted by a 73-year-old retired public servant. "If they will not throw you out, I will do it myself," Preston screamed, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. He reached behind his back, sliding his hand under his expensive, tailored suit jacket. The crowd surrounding him gasped and scrambled backward in pure terror. Women screamed and men ducked, covering their heads. Preston pulled his hand out. His fingers were wrapped tightly around the grip of a compact black handgun. He raised the weapon, pointing the dark steel barrel directly at my chest, right in the middle of a crowded luxury party. He was completely out of his mind, willing to commit murder in front of hundreds of witnesses just to silence the man who had destroyed his empire. But I did not flinch, and I did not step back. I just stared down the barrel of his gun, knowing that he had just made the final fatal mistake that would bring the wrath of the federal government crashing down on his head. The barrel of the compact black handgun was aimed directly at the center of my chest. I was 73 years old, standing on a wooden stage in my own backyard, looking down the dark, hollow steel of a loaded weapon. The wealthy elite of Chicago, the politicians, the corporate developers, and the socialites who had come to drink expensive champagne and celebrate the demolition of my home were completely hysterical. Women in designer dresses screamed and dove onto the temporary wooden decking covering my late wife's beautiful garden. Men in custom-tailored suits scrambled over each other, knocking over tables and shattering crystal glasses in a desperate, blind panic to get out of the line of fire. The mayor of Chicago threw himself behind a heavy stone planter. The private security guards who Julian had hired to keep out the riffraff were sprinting toward the service exits, completely abandoning their arrogant employers. Preston Gallagher stood his ground near the front row, holding the gun with a white-knuckled grip. His face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure, desperate rage. His chest heaved and sweat poured down his forehead, ruining his slicked-back hair and staining his expensive collar. He was a cornered animal. The massive 50-foot financial document glowing on the screen behind me had completely destroyed his life. The audio recording of his own criminal confession had erased his lucrative career as a bank vice president. He had absolutely nothing left to lose, and his fractured mind had decided that the only way to regain control of this nightmare was to pull the trigger and silence the old African-American man who had orchestrated his downfall. I did not close my eyes. I did not raise my hands, begging for mercy. I gripped the edges of the crystal podium and stared right back at him with the cold, unforgiving, absolute authority of a man who had spent 3 decades auditing the most ruthless predators in the financial world. I knew something that Preston did not. I knew the exact timeline of the federal operation. I knew that the 10-minute countdown for the offshore wire transfer had just hit zero. The stolen money was locked, the trap was permanently sealed, and the cavalry was already here. Preston took a deep, ragged breath and his finger began to tighten on the trigger. He opened his mouth to shout one final arrogant threat, but his words were completely drowned out by a catastrophic, deafening roar that seemed to tear the very sky open. It was not a gunshot. It was the terrifying mechanical thunder of twin turbine engines. The violent, rhythmic chopping sound of heavy helicopter rotor blades suddenly overwhelmed the screams of the crowd and the pulsing bass of the DJ music. The wind in the garden instantly whipped into a violent artificial hurricane, blowing expensive linen tablecloths into the air and knocking over heavy silver catering trays. Before Preston could even pull the trigger, a massive high-intensity searchlight blasted down from the dark sky above. The blinding, brilliant white beam hit the center of the garden with the force of a physical blow. It illuminated the entire yard, turning the night into stark, terrifying daylight. The massive beam tracked directly onto Preston Gallagher, freezing him completely in his tracks. He squinted, throwing his free arm up to shield his sensitive eyes from the blinding glare. The gun in his hand suddenly looked like a cheap plastic toy under the overwhelming, terrifying spotlight of the United States government. "Drop the weapon right now. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Drop the weapon and put your hands on your head." The command boomed from a high-powered megaphone mounted on the dark helicopter hovering just above the old oak tree. The voice was mechanical, distorted, and absolutely lethal. At that exact same second, the heavy wrought iron gates at the front of my property were violently blown open. The deafening crash of heavy metal slamming against brick echoed through the neighborhood. Two massive black armored tactical vehicles surged into the driveway, crushing Julian's expensive imported sports car beneath their heavy tires without a single moment of hesitation. The garden was instantly flooded with a sea of dark tactical gear. Dozens of heavily armed federal agents poured into the backyard, moving with terrifying, coordinated precision. Across the backs of their armored vests, the bold yellow letters flashed under the strobe lights. FBI, SWAT, FDIC, Office of Inspector General. The red beams of laser sights cut through the dusty, wind-whipped air, painting dozens of targeting dots directly onto Preston's chest. The elite crowd of investors and developers hit the dirt, pressing their faces into the grass, placing their hands behind their heads in absolute submission. The glamorous corporate demolition party had transformed into a militarized federal raid in less than 10 seconds. Julian realized that his entire life was completely over. The arrogant real estate broker who had thrown his own father into the freezing rain to secure a payday suddenly lost his mind. He looked at the heavily armed agents swarming the patio. He looked at the helicopter searchlight blinding his brother-in-law. He turned his back on his wife and sprinted blindly toward the wooden fence at the back of the property, desperately hoping to hop the barrier and disappear into the dark residential alley. He did not even make it 10 yards. A massive federal agent wearing heavy body armor launched himself forward, executing a flawless, devastating tackle. The agent's shoulder caught Julian right in the center of his back. The sickening thud of the impact echoed over the helicopter blades. Julian was driven violently into the ground, his face smashing directly into the damp earth of the very garden he had planned to bulldoze. His expensive tailored gray suit was instantly torn and covered in mud. Two more agents descended on him, pinning his arms painfully behind his back. The sharp ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sealed his fate. He was crying, sobbing into the dirt, a broken, pathetic coward who had traded his soul for nothing. Victoria was completely hysterical. When she saw Julian get tackled into the mud, her knees finally gave out entirely. She collapsed onto the wooden decking, tearing her expensive designer dress. She threw her hands in the air, mascara running down her face in thick black streams. She was screaming, crying out to the federal agents, begging for mercy. She shrieked that she did not know anything about the fraudulent $4 million loan. She wailed that her brother and her husband had manipulated her and that she was just an innocent victim. But the agents did not even blink. A female tactical officer grabbed Victoria by the arms, hauled her roughly to her feet, and slammed her against a catering table, reading her Miranda rights as she slapped the heavy steel cuffs onto her wrists. Her fake corporate logistics empire was completely finished. Preston Gallagher stood in the center of the blinding helicopter spotlight. The gun was still in his hand, but it was trembling violently. He looked at the dozens of red laser dots painting his chest. He looked at the armored federal agents moving in a tight tactical formation, slowly closing the circle around him. He realized that if he raised that weapon even a single inch, they would completely obliterate him. The arrogant bank vice president slowly opened his fingers. The black handgun dropped to the grass with a dull thud. But Preston was not ready to surrender. He was a cornered rat. He spun around and made a desperate, frantic dash toward the sliding glass doors of the main house. He thought he could lose himself in the dark hallways and find a basement window to escape the perimeter. He sprinted across the patio, his expensive shoes slipping on the spilled champagne. He lunged through the sliding glass doors and ran straight into an absolute nightmare. A 6-man tactical SWAT team had already breached the front of the house and was clearing the living room. As Preston burst through the back doors, a massive, heavily armored operator stepped forward and swung his tactical shield like a battering ram. The heavy ballistic shield slammed directly into Preston's chest with the force of a moving truck. Preston flew backward, crashing brutally onto the marble floor of the foyer, right into the massive puddle of shattered crystal and spilled champagne that Maya had created earlier. He groaned in absolute agony, clutching his ribs. Before he could even try to crawl away, heavy combat boots pinned him to the floor. 4 SWAT officers dropped their knees onto his back, burying his face in the sticky, wine-soaked marble. They ripped his arms behind him and secured him with thick, heavy-duty zip ties. The architect of the entire federal bank fraud was reduced to a bleeding, gasping prisoner in the ruins of the home he tried to steal. I stood completely still on the wooden stage, watching the chaos unfold. The wind from the helicopter blades whipped my white shirt and stung my eyes, but I did not look away. The perimeter was entirely locked down. Every single exit was heavily guarded. My son, my daughter-in-law, and the corrupt bank executive were all in federal custody. The raid was a total, absolute tactical success. I looked toward the front gate. Walking calmly through the sea of armored vehicles and tactical teams was a tall, distinguished man wearing a sharp charcoal suit. It was Donovan Carter, the former regional director of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. He walked straight past the crying billionaires and the handcuffed criminals. He stopped at the edge of the stage, looked up at me, and gave a slow, respectful nod. The sweep was complete. The ghosts of this house had finally been exorcised. The violent artificial hurricane from the helicopter blades finally began to slow down as the pilot pulled the massive aircraft higher into the night sky. The blinding white searchlight swept away from the garden, leaving the backyard bathed in the harsh red and blue flashing lights of a dozen armored federal vehicles parked outside my gates. The deafening roar of the engines faded into a low, heavy rumble, but the silence that replaced it on the ground was far more terrifying for the 3 criminals lying in the mud. I stepped down from the wooden stage. My right arm was throbbing, but I stood tall. The elite crowd of Chicago politicians, venture capitalists, and real estate developers were slowly picking themselves up from the damp grass. Their expensive custom-tailored suits and designer evening gowns were completely ruined by mud and spilled champagne. But they did not care about their clothes. They were staring in absolute stunned horror at the center of the patio. Victoria was kneeling on the wooden decking. Her stunning designer dress was torn and stained with dirt. The heavy steel handcuffs locked tightly around her wrists dug into her skin. She looked around at the dozen heavily armed FBI agents standing over her. She looked at the mayor of Chicago, who was staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Victoria was a parasite who had spent her entire adult life climbing the social ladder by using other people. She had built a fake logistics empire on stolen funds and a fake marriage on stolen equity. Now that the ladder was burning, she did exactly what a parasite always does. She desperately tried to find someone else to throw into the fire. Victoria twisted her body violently on the deck and pointed her cuffed hands directly at my son. It was him, she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her shrill voice echoed across the silent garden, cutting through the cold night air. She looked frantically at the tactical team leader and cried out that it was all Julian. She shrieked that he was the one who forged the documents and tricked his old father into signing the Medicare paperwork. She wailed that she was just an innocent wife who trusted her husband. She actually forced tears to stream down her mascara-stained face, swearing to the federal agents that she had absolutely no idea the $4 million commercial loan was completely fraudulent. She said Julian manipulated her and used her logistics company without her knowledge. Julian was lying face down in the dirt just a few yards away. 2 federal agents hauled him roughly to his knees. His expensive gray suit was completely destroyed. His face was covered in mud and his lip was bleeding from where he hit the ground. When he heard his own wife selling him out to the federal government to save her own skin, his fragile, arrogant ego completely shattered into a million pieces. Julian jerked his shoulders against the grip of the federal agents. His face turned bright red with an uncontrollable, blinding fury. He looked at the woman he had betrayed his own father for, and he absolutely lost his mind. "You lying snake!" Julian roared. Spit flew from his bleeding mouth as he screamed back at his wife right in front of the entire Chicago elite. Julian yelled that Victoria was the one who orchestrated the entire nightmare. He screamed to the federal agents that she had embezzled millions of dollars from her own corporate clients to buy her expensive cars and designer jewelry. He told the crowd that Victoria was facing a mandatory state audit and she came to him in a panic. Julian yelled that she threatened to divorce him, take every penny he had and ruin his real estate career if he did not find a way to get her $4 million by the end of the month. He screamed that she was the one who demanded they use my house as collateral. He said she forced him to throw his own father out into the rain because she needed the cash to cover her own massive federal crimes. The wealthy guests standing on the lawn gasped. The real estate developers from Apex Development shook their heads in absolute revulsion. The glamorous power couple of the Chicago corporate scene was publicly ripping each other to pieces like rabid animals in a cage. They were stripping away every last ounce of their fake dignity, exposing the ugly, greedy truth underneath. Before Victoria could scream another lie, a loud commotion erupted near the shattered sliding glass doors of the main house. 4 heavily armored SWAT officers dragged Preston Gallagher out onto the patio. The corrupt bank vice president was no longer walking with the arrogant swagger of a Wall Street titan. His custom suit was soaked in spilled vintage champagne, and his slicked-back hair hung in messy clumps over his sweating face. His hands were securely zip-tied behind his back, and he was limping heavily from where the tactical shield had slammed into his chest. Preston was thrust onto the grass right next to his sister and his brother-in-law. He heard them screaming at each other, throwing accusations back and forth, trying to save their own lives. The architect of the entire offshore money laundering conspiracy looked at his accomplices with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. Preston spat a mouthful of blood onto the wooden decking and cursed them both. He screamed that they were pathetic, cowardly idiots. He yelled that he had risked his entire lucrative career at Oakmont Regional Bank to build a foolproof offshore pipeline to save his stupid sister from a federal prison sentence. He roared that if Julian had not panicked over a single anonymous email and forced the wire transfer tonight, they would all be on a private plane to the Cayman Islands by tomorrow. He blamed Julian for being a weak coward, and he blamed Victoria for being a careless, greedy liability. Preston cursed the day he ever met my son and told his sister he hoped she rotted in a concrete cell for the rest of her miserable life. The federal agents did not try to stop the screaming match. They just stood back and let the 3 masterminds of a multi-million-dollar bank fraud confess to every single detail of their conspiracy in front of hundreds of witnesses. Donovan Carter, the former regional director of the FDIC, walked slowly across the patio and stood next to me. He watched the 3 criminals tearing each other apart with a look of absolute cold satisfaction. He told me the federal prosecutors were not even going to need the digital tracking data to get a conviction. He said they were doing the job for us. The tactical team leader finally raised his hand, signaling that the show was over. The heavily armored agents grabbed Julian, Victoria, and Preston by their collars and hauled them to their feet. It was time for the final walk. The agents marched the 3 criminals through the center of the garden. The wealthy elite guests who had just minutes ago been drinking their champagne and kissing their rings now parted ways like they were letting diseased rats pass through. Nobody offered sympathy. Nobody offered a high-priced defense attorney. The corporate vultures just stared at them with pure, unadulterated contempt. As they were paraded toward the front gates, the local news reporters who had been invited to cover a glossy real estate launch realized they had the scoop of a lifetime. The journalists pushed their way to the front of the crowd. Dozens of heavy camera lenses focused directly on the 3 disgraced executives. The brilliant white flashes of the cameras erupted like a localized lightning storm. Flash after flash illuminated their muddy, ruined clothes and their tear-stained faces. Every single humiliating second was permanently captured for the front pages of the morning newspapers. Victoria tried to duck her head to hide from the blinding lights, crying hysterically, but the federal agents kept her moving forward. Julian stared blankly at the ground, a completely broken man who had traded his legacy for a pair of steel handcuffs. Preston glared at the cameras with pure venom, knowing his face would be broadcast on every financial news network in the country as the poster boy for corporate greed. I stood on the patio and watched the heavy armored federal transport vehicles idling in my driveway. The agents shoved my son, my daughter-in-law, and the corrupt bank vice president into the dark, cramped cages in the back of the vans. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive, echoing finality. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the old oak tree in the front yard. The engines roared as the convoy pulled away from the property, taking the architects of my destruction away to a cold, concrete federal holding facility. The garden was finally quiet. The guests were slowly being escorted off the premises by the remaining agents. I took a deep breath of the cool night air. The heavy toxic poison that had infected my home was finally gone. The raid was over, but the true healing was just about to begin. The morning after the raid, my neighborhood was quiet, but the financial world of Chicago was on fire. The local and national news networks broadcast the footage of the arrests on a continuous loop. Preston Gallagher's face was plastered on the front page of every major newspaper, labeled as the mastermind of a $4 million corporate embezzlement scheme. But the real earthquake happened on Monday morning. Exactly as Donovan Carter had promised, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation descended on Oakmont Regional Bank. Before the tellers could even unlock the front glass doors, armed federal agents and forensic accountants swarmed the building. They seized the massive steel vaults, they locked the computer servers, and they officially took over the entire institution. Preston's arrogance had not just destroyed his own life, it had brought down an entire regional bank, leaving his former colleagues completely stunned as federal regulators boxed up their files. The wheels of federal justice grind slowly for some people, but when you hand the Department of Justice a fully documented, perfectly packaged case of international money laundering, they move with terrifying speed. There were no lengthy appeals. There were no drawn-out legal maneuvers or secret plea deals. The trial took place just 6 months later in a cold, wood-paneled federal courtroom in downtown Chicago. I sat in the front row of the gallery wearing my best dark suit. I rested both hands on the handle of my wooden cane and watched the heavy oak doors open. United States Marshals escorted Julian, Victoria, and Preston into the room. They were completely unrecognizable. The expensive tailored suits, the silk ties, and the designer dresses were gone, replaced by standard-issue shapeless orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy steel chains that clanked loudly against the polished floor with every step they took. They looked pale, exhausted, and entirely broken. They did not look at each other. The bitter, screaming hatred that had exploded on my patio that night had hardened into a permanent, silent resentment. When the lead federal prosecutor stood up to present the case, the defense attorneys practically shrank into their leather chairs. You cannot cross-examine a digital timestamp authorized by your own client. You cannot negotiate away an offshore wire transfer caught in real time by federal tracking software. And you absolutely cannot defend a crystal-clear audio recording of a bank vice president confessing to forging a collateral pledge and laundering stolen equity to the Cayman Islands. The evidence was an impenetrable fortress of truth. The jury did not even need to deliberate for a full day. The verdict was a swift, absolute guillotine closing the chapter on their fraudulent empire. The federal judge asked the 3 defendants to stand for sentencing. He looked down at them from his high wooden bench with a look of profound disgust. He addressed Preston first. The judge called him a disgrace to the financial sector and a ruthless predator who used his executive power to orchestrate a massive international felony. He said the banking system relies on trust, and Preston had poisoned that well for his own greedy offshore retirement fund. The judge brought the heavy wooden gavel down and sentenced Preston Gallagher to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Preston simply closed his eyes and let his head drop, staring at the floor as the massive weight of 2 decades behind bars crushed the last remnants of his arrogant ego. Then the judge turned his attention to my son and my daughter-in-law. He did not hold back a single ounce of his contempt. He said that white-collar crime was bad enough, but to actively scheme to render an elderly father homeless for a corporate payout was a level of moral bankruptcy that the court rarely witnessed. He convicted them of conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, and severe elder abuse. The judge brought this gavel down for the second time, sentencing both Julian and Victoria to 15 years in federal prison. Victoria let out a loud, agonizing wail. She collapsed into her wooden chair, sobbing uncontrollably, burying her face in her chained hands. She realized she would spend the rest of her youth locked in a cold concrete cell, far away from the luxury, the status, and the high society parties she had destroyed her entire family to obtain. Her logistics company was liquidated, and her fake corporate royalty was reduced to a prison identification number. Julian did not cry. He stood there trembling slightly, his hollow eyes fixed on the judge. Then, as the armed marshals moved in to lead him away, he turned his head and looked across the crowded courtroom directly at me. He looked like a lost, terrified boy, desperately searching for his father to save him from a nightmare. He mouthed the words, "I am sorry." I did not nod. I did not smile. I did not offer him a single ounce of forgiveness or comfort. I just stared back at him with a cold, blank expression. I had given him my youth, my love, and my protection. He had taken all of it and thrown me to the wolves for a real estate deal. I was no longer his father. I was just the auditor who balanced his final ledger. The marshals grabbed his arms and dragged him out of the courtroom through the heavy side doors, taking him away to pay his debt to society. With the criminal trial concluded, the final piece of the puzzle was the civil restitution. The following morning, I sat in a bright, quiet conference room at the federal courthouse with Donovan Carter and a senior federal magistrate. Because Preston had orchestrated the commercial loan using stolen collateral and forged signatures, the entire financial instrument was legally classified as the fruit of a poisonous tree. The federal magistrate explained that Oakmont Regional Bank had acted with gross criminal negligence by allowing a vice president to bypass underwriting protocols to fund his own sister. The bank was liable for the entire $4 million loss. The magistrate stamped a thick stack of documents with a heavy red seal. With a single stroke of his pen, he officially voided the commercial mortgage contract. He completely nullified the collateral pledge that Julian had tricked me into signing when I could not find my reading glasses. The legal eviction that had thrown me out into the pouring rain was instantly overturned. My home was no longer collateral. It was no longer corporate property waiting to be bulldozed by greedy real estate developers. The deed was entirely clear, completely unencumbered, and legally restored to my name. I did not owe the bank a single cent. I did not have to pay a single dollar in legal fees because the FDIC had absorbed the entire case as a federal banking prosecution. Donovan Carter smiled and slid the thick manila folder across the polished mahogany table. "Welcome home, Harry," he said softly. I placed my hand flat on top of the folder. The rough texture of the paper felt more valuable than gold or diamonds. I thanked Donovan for his unwavering loyalty and his relentless pursuit of justice. I thanked the magistrate for his time. I stood up from the heavy leather chair, picking up my wooden cane and the folder that contained my life. I walked out of the federal courthouse and stepped into the bright, warm sunlight of downtown Chicago. The air felt lighter and cleaner. The constant throbbing pain in my right arm had finally faded into a dull, distant memory. The violent storm that had ripped through my life had finally passed, leaving behind a clear, endless sky. I had faced the absolute worst betrayal a man can endure. I had been stripped of my dignity, my safety, and my family. But I did not break, and I did not surrender. I used my mind, my experience, and my unyielding resilience to tear down a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. I hailed a taxi and gave the driver the address of a quiet suburban street. I leaned back against the seat, watching the city roll by through the window. It was time to go back to the place where my late wife Beatrice had planted her beautiful roses. It was time to unlock the heavy oak doors and let the fresh air blow through the hallways. The ghosts of greed and betrayal were permanently locked in federal cages miles away. The house belonged to me again, and the silence waiting for me there was the sweet, peaceful silence of absolute victory. The heavy brass key slid perfectly into the front door of my home. The familiar click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet foyer was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I pushed the heavy oak door open and stepped inside. There were no armed sheriff deputies waiting to throw me out into the pouring rain. There was no arrogant son standing on the porch avoiding my eyes. There was no cruel daughter-in-law telling me to go find a homeless shelter. The house was completely empty and bathed in the warm golden light of the late afternoon sun. I walked slowly through the hallway, listening to the steady tap of my wooden cane against the floorboards. I was 73 years old, and I had just survived the most brutal, terrifying war of my entire life. I had walked through the fire of betrayal, and I had returned with the deed to my home secured firmly in my hand. But the house still carried the toxic scars of Victoria and Julian. The interior was completely unrecognizable from the warm, loving home where my late wife Beatrice and I had raised our family. Victoria had painted the beautiful walls a cold, sterile gray to make it look like a cheap corporate waiting room. She had covered the rich cherry wood floors with gaudy white rugs and replaced my father's antique grandfather clock with a flashy mirrored liquor cabinet. I did not want to spend a single night surrounded by the physical reminders of their fraudulent empire. I hired a crew of local contractors the very next morning. We worked from sunrise to sunset, ripping out every single piece of cheap luxury decor Victoria had brought into the house. We rolled up the white rugs and threw them into a massive dumpster in the driveway. We stripped the cold gray paint off the walls and repainted the entire house in the warm, inviting beige tones that Beatrice had always loved. I went to an antique dealer downtown and purchased a beautiful, towering mahogany grandfather clock. I placed it in the exact corner where the old one used to stand. With every stroke of the paintbrush and every piece of furniture restored, I felt a heavy layer of grief lifting off my shoulders. I was not just renovating a house. I was actively erasing their betrayal from my life. The backyard had suffered the most devastating damage. The temporary wooden decking from their glamorous demolition party had crushed Beatrice's prized rose bushes and delicate hydrangeas. The rich, dark soil had been trampled by the expensive leather shoes of the corporate elite who came to celebrate my destruction. It took me 3 full weeks of hard physical labor digging my bare hands into the earth to bring the garden back to life. My knees ached and my back throbbed, but it was a good, honest ache. It was the ache of a man rebuilding his sanctuary. I planted fresh, vibrant red roses. I watered the roots of the old oak tree I had planted when Julian was just a little boy. I restored the flower beds exactly the way my late wife had designed them. When the first new rose finally bloomed, I sat on the wooden bench in the garden and smiled. I felt her gentle presence in the warm evening breeze. She knew her home was finally safe from the vultures. A good auditor knows how to balance a complex financial ledger, but a good man knows how to repay loyalty and courage. Maya Jackson had risked her freedom, her career, and her very life to help an old homeless man take down a massive federal conspiracy. She could have easily turned me in to Preston Gallagher to save her own job, but she chose to do the right thing when the world demanded cowardice. She crawled through a dark ventilation duct to secure the digital footprint of a $4 million money laundering operation. I was not going to let a woman of her caliber go unrewarded. I made a private phone call to Donovan Carter, the former regional director of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in Washington. I told him the entire story of the brilliant, brave young African-American woman who had secured the raw data we needed to freeze the offshore wire transfer. Donovan was highly impressed. Oakmont Regional Bank was currently under strict federal receivership, and Maya was technically out of a job. But less than a week after our phone call, Maya received an official offer letter from the federal government. She was hired as a junior bank examiner for the FDIC. I met her for a quiet lunch at a nice restaurant downtown to celebrate the news. When she showed me the official federal badge, she broke down in tears of pure joy. She thanked me over and over again for changing her entire life. I looked at her and told her she earned every single bit of it by showing true character. I told her the federal government was incredibly lucky to have an examiner with her unyielding integrity. We hugged outside the restaurant, and I watched her walk away to start a brilliant, secure new career. I had balanced the ledger. Now the storm is completely over. It is a bright, beautiful Sunday morning in Chicago. I am standing on the front porch of my home wearing a comfortable sweater and holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. The steam rises gently into the cool, crisp morning air. I look out over the manicured green lawn, the sturdy brick walls, and the heavy iron gates that now keep the predators firmly on the outside. I have swept the traitors from my life completely. Julian, Victoria, and Preston are currently sitting in cold concrete federal cells trading their expensive tailored suits for bright orange jumpsuits. They will spend the next 15 to 20 years staring at steel bars thinking about the old man they thought they could simply throw out into the freezing rain. They underestimated my mind, they underestimated my resolve, and they completely underestimated the undeniable, devastating power of the truth. I take a slow sip of my coffee. The silence of the neighborhood is no longer heavy or oppressive. It is the sweet, peaceful sound of absolute victory. A home is not just a structure of wood and brick. It is the physical manifestation of a lifetime of honest labor and unconditional sacrifice. When a child chooses greed over gratitude, they do not just steal property, they bankrupt their own soul. True wealth is never found in fraudulent contracts or stolen inheritances. It resides in the unwavering dignity of a person who knows their own worth. You can strip a man of his possessions, but you can never steal his resilience. Blood may give you family, but character dictates whether you deserve them. Did you enjoy my story? I would love to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you would have done in my position in the comments below. Please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video to help others who might be facing a similar battle in the shadows. Remember to always trust your instincts and never let anyone steal your dignity. I will see you in the next story.